Can I welcome everyone to the Police and Crime Committee meeting? This morning we will be holding a discussion on violence against women and girls and its impact on young people in London. Our microphones today are as always on, so please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode and allow others to finish speaking to avoid any interruptions to the sound. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. We've received apologies from Assembly Member Ahmad.
Thank you, Lauren. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 29th of January 2025 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can we note the ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee?
Noted.
Thank you. And can we note the responses received from the Metropolitan Police Service?
Okay.
Lovely. Thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, and I would like to welcome our first panel of guests. Janya Walker, who is Head of Public Affairs End Violence Against Women Coalition, and Sanskriti Sangji, Policy, Campaigns and Communications Officer at Southall Black Sisters. So welcome both of you, and thank you so much for coming. We're going to take it in turns asking various questions, and I'll start. So Janaea, if you want to start, and then I'll come to you. In your professional experience, how would you describe young people's experience of VAWG, which, and if anybody's watching, that is violence against women and girls, and we'll use that term, I suspect, quite a bit this morning in London.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So, yes, so I'm here from the End Violence Against Women Coalition, and just to give a bit of context, so we're based in London, but we have a membership of over 160 organisations across the UK, who are primarily frontline sort of specialist support services working with women, victims and survivors and girls, but also researchers and academics and survivors as well. In terms of the picture of violence against women and girls in London, it remains the case that it is endemic. It's something which shapes women and girls' lives across their life course. And in terms of the experience within London, it's quite difficult to conclude in terms of whether things are getting better or getting worse, just because the data is quite poor. And we know that the Violence Reduction Unit has done some research in terms of a strategic needs assessment of violence in London, but that only captures domestic abuse and sexual violence to an extent, and a lot of it's reliant on police recorded data. So we can go by the kind of experiences of our members in frontline services, where we know that demand for support is incredibly high. We know that, for example, the experience of sexual harassment, it tends to be experienced more disproportionately by younger age groups. There was a report by Forward UK just in October last year, which found that 8 in 10 young women in London have faced sexual harassment and sexual assault in the last 2 years. And that matches
8 out of 10.
8 out of 10.
And that's women under 16.
Sorry, I've just got to think young women, so I can clarify that.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be in the younger age group.
Sorry, excuse me.
Just can I just quickly ask a question?
No, can we let the lady finish, and then I'll come to you. Sorry.
That matches up with the more broader sort of research that's done by the Office for National Statistics, who also find that reports of sexual harassment and assault are most common among the younger age groups as well. When we take into account what's happening online as well, it's a similar picture. So there was a large study done by the Open University, and they found that women experiencing online violence were also more likely to be under the age of 25 for that category. So it's a really serious issue, and it has been, as we know, for some time. We can obviously get into the context and what's happening in London and some of the work of MOPAC and the Violence Reduction Unit, but it feels as though lots of services really are struggling, and young women and girls are really struggling in terms of getting access to support and then finding out what routes to sort of justice or routes to get mental health support are available, but it's clearly bleak in many ways. And
it's getting worse by the sound of it. I'm going to ask Sanskriti to answer the question, and then I'll take any other questions on that.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having us as well. I'm here on behalf of Southall Black Sisters. We are a buy-in for Black, minoritized, and migrant women's organization. We provide direct casework, advocacy, counseling, support group services in a certain catchment area, and then we also have a national campaigning and advocacy platform where we use strategic litigation as a tool as well. Over 70% of the victim survivors that we work with face honor-based abuse, which means there are multiple perpetrators involved, and over 60% of our service users have no recourse to public funds, which is a condition, immigration condition, that prevents access to benefits and housing assistance for victim survivors of domestic abuse, but it's applied to over 2 million immigrants who live in the UK, their visa statuses. So in our frontline experience of over 40 years, the kind of violence against women and girls that Black, minoritized, and migrant women face is primarily due to the structural barriers such as institutional racism and the hostile immigration environment policies like no recourse to public funds condition. And this manifests in a number of ways for women and girls. It results in presumptive criminalization, which we see in many of our cases, heightened victim disbelief, cultural taboos not being understood, not being provided a culturally sensitive response, statutory exclusion from safeguarding duties, and denial of duties even where those are applicable by social services, for instance, under Section 17 of the Children Act. And all of these go to significantly discourage Black, minoritized, and migrant women from coming forward and reporting, and even when they do report, they very often disengage due to these very reasons. A particularly tragic example from London is that of Banaz Mahmood, who was murdered at the age of 20 years old, a very young girl, by her father, uncle, and male cousins, and she had reported up to 5 times to the police, including naming the perpetrators who ended up killing her, and the police never took her quite seriously. And that mirrors our experience at the front line. We see honor-based abuse, immigration abuse, consistently ignored, dismissed, a fear of a sensitive cultural threshold, that leads to women and girls being failed. In particular, no recourse to public funds is what has a massive impact on young people. So when women and girls with no recourse to public funds attempt to escape abuse, there are 2 primary barriers to them even escaping. The first is the absence of a firewall that prevents data sharing between the police and immigration enforcement. As per the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, all police forces in England and Wales routinely share immigration data of victim survivors with immigration enforcement. This creates a weaponized fear of deportation that prevents women and girls from coming forward. The other barrier that they have is a tiered system of statutory support. Only migrant women that are on spousal or partner visas of British citizens or those with indefinite leave to remain have a combined model of status and support, which is under the Migrant Victims of Domestic Abuse concession and the Domestic Violence Indefinite Leave to Remain. All other women who are on any other migrant visa type are excluded from the combined model. And these discourage them from coming forward. And even when they do come forward, they face a really stark choice between domestic abuse, destitution, and deportation because of having no access to public funds and possibly being reported to immigration enforcement. This has massive impacts for the young girls that are escaping in the first place. The recent example, not from London, of Harshita Prala at the age of 24 is a stark example. But in London, in the direct casework that we do as well, in Ealing, Hounslow, and Hillingdon, this has a massive impact on the children that the women escape with. Destitute, they're unable to provide the children with a nutritious diet. Many of them are living solely on canned food. They're unable to live in good conditions. These living conditions very frequently violate and contravene their human rights. And very often these children's experiences of their lives don't map onto those of their peers. And this leads to them going back after summer vacations and being ousted from peer groups because their experiences are so different, being victim survivors' children that have no recourse to public funds. I'm sure there'll be more to say. But
Well, we'll tease out some questions. Can I ask, is there any way we can make this louder? Because I am having trouble hearing. Be very, very grateful. And colleagues, if we can make sure that our guests can hear us as well. Because I do apologise, the sound system in City Hall went down yesterday and it's not up to what it should be. Assembly Member Bailey, did you want to come
morning time, so I guess
Speak up.
you spoke about 8 out of 10 young women, mainly young women, being victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Do you have a breakdown of those two figures, because they're two different offences?
No, so I can share the report with the committee afterwards. So it's a report by Forward UK from October last year. I don't have the
Okay, thank
with
you.
me, but
Through the
happy to
chair.
follow up on
Thank you,
that,
that would be much
absolutely.
appreciated. Thank you, Chair.
That would, thank you. Gareth.
Thank you. This is a question for Sanskriti. It's just you mentioned the cultural sensitivities issue regarding some of the aspects which you discussed. Would you suggest that the lessons which should have been learned from Rochdale, for example, have still yet to be learned or to be enabled within this million?
Yeah, I think in our experience, and this comes from our frontline staff, I think one of the questions we regularly, periodically check on is, in the frontline statutory services that we're dealing with, are we seeing cultural competency, which we understand that they are being trained in? Is that reflecting in the way that services are being provided? And in our experience, that definitely isn't happening. So something that we very often use, and it's very often used in the context of honor-based abuse, is the one-chance rule, that victim survivors have just the one chance to potentially reach out for help, and whichever statutory agency that they've reached out to, or whichever service they've reached out to, is possibly having this one chance to help them. And in our experience, the police, for instance, the Met Police in London, don't have an understanding of the one chance rule, and women who are experiencing honor-based abuse have to quite repeatedly call and try to explain their experiences. I think there's also other ways in which we see it manifest. So especially for young girls, girls between the ages of 14 to 24 that are trying to escape abuse, there's an aggravated fear, especially in the communities we work in, of being shunned and ousted from their community, or facing some kind of aggression from their own religion. They're very often also feeling guilt about calling out a perpetrator that's potentially a family member. And very often, this combined with the absence of a firewall, if they have no recourse to public funds, can make them very wary of reporting to statutory services. And even when they do report, because these cultural ideas that they're struggling with are misunderstood and seen as disengagement, they feel quite unsupported. So there's definitely a lot of lessons there yet to be learned.
So is it, if I may, just one further check, so is it, in Rochdale, as I understand it, there was a reluctance on the part of various statutory bodies to intervene because they felt that they were that they would be perceived as racist, or is it less a reluctance now rather than a lack of training, a lack of understanding? So there's a willingness, but the training is yet to be given.
I think it's a combination of both. We still see a reluctance as well, and sometimes that reluctance is due to heightened victim disbelief. Sometimes that reluctance is due to them just not understanding the victim survivor. There are significant communication and literacy barriers that we don't always see overcome for victim survivors as well, and that fear of a sensitive cultural threshold does continue. Where we do hear from statutory services, this must just be how their culture is, or they must just be more patriarchal, which are inherently racist comments that tend to isolate and silo the kind of abuse that these victim survivors are facing, that we see along the spectrum of violence against women and girls in general. But we do see that siloing effect of saying this must just be their culture and this is how they are. And that's something that we then have to advocate quite strongly against and challenge them on. And something that we see with social services as well, which is a continuation or an extension of this, is this worrying trend that we're starting to see of social services saying our duty is to the child, so we'll safeguard the child, but we don't have a duty to you as the mother. We're happy to buy you a ticket to go back to your country of origin, but there's nothing more we can do for you. And that is a particularly worrying trend in our direct case work in London as well. So I think that fear of a sensitive cultural threshold does continue to exist. So there's both reluctance, and where there is willingness, there's also additional fears due to not understanding culture.
That's very useful. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. And of course that leads to lots or a lack of reporting, which we're all aware that there's a lack of reporting. Very briefly, because I want to move on, you say they haven't got access to public money. What would that money particularly be for? Rehousing, etc.? Because if we're looking at rehousing, we all know the issues around that as well? Is that mainly what you would want that money to be for?
So public funds is something that most migrants are denied access to. It includes a gamut of different benefits, income benefits, housing assistance under the Homelessness Act. And these are the kinds of benefits that at the moment there's a tiered immigration system for. So there are women who are on different visa types in our service. There are migrant women who are on spousal partner visas.
Okay.
And then there are women who are on student visas, worker visas, and dependents of student and worker visas,
Okay.
and undocumented women. And at the moment, none of them have recourse to public funds. But under the MVDAC and DVILR, victims who are on spousal partner visas can get access to public funds. But for the others, it's either temporary recourse for 3 months or not at all.
Okay.
So it would be public funds in general for income and housing benefits.
Right, thank you. Right, if I can come back to you, Janya. The data landscape around VORG is complex and often does not allow for specific data to be extracted, specifically on young people, and we're looking at girls, women from 25 and under, and that's what we're concentrating on in this report. Now, how do you think that that data can be improved? What do you think should happen so that we could get more access to this data?
Yeah, I think that's a really important consideration. I think one of the things which I referenced to earlier is that there is currently already sort of what they call the strategic needs assessment is carried out in London. I think the most recent version that's come under the serious violence duty, so there's a requirement to collect data on the picture of violence in London. But as I said, it only captures domestic abuse and sexual violence. And it's quite limited in the types of data that it uses, so it relies quite heavily on police data, which we know is not an accurate representation of what's actually happening. So I guess a clear recommendation would be for there to be a strategic needs assessment across London, which captures all forms of violence against women and girls, so not only domestic abuse and sexual violence, but as Sanskriti said, honour-based abuse, online violence against women and girls, and all of the other forms which impact young people's lives. From the data, I think even at a national level, the data that we do know, it's quite limited for young people. So the Office for National Statistics, their crime survey is for 16 and over, but you'd have a gap for those younger than that. There have been calls for some time for there to be a prevalence study, so to capture child sexual abuse, for example, which is across the lifespan from a very young age often as well. But I think that ask for a strategic needs assessment of VORG in London would be a really good start. I understand that there was some research commissioned by the BRU recently which showed some concerning figures with what we do know around violence against women and girls, which again, picking up Sanskriti's point, it showed a real worrying trend in terms of disproportionality among black young women, and particularly in the age group of 18 to 24 in terms of being overrepresented as victims. That's again mirrored at a national level where we see some disproportionality where, for example, women of mixed ethnicity have a higher risk of sexual assault. So I think there's a lot more that could be done, both to get, I guess, like a baseline figure for what's happening in London, and then to break that down to look at some of the inequalities, for example, around black and minoritised women, but also disabled survivors, LGBT survivors as well, because the pictures are not clear enough now, and that, I think that's sometimes creates difficulties for services when they're trying to sort of make the case that demand is really high and that they need the support to be able to deliver services over a longer period. But the data's patchy from the perspective of what we know at a London level and also at a national level as well.
Well, that's right, because if you can't prove that there's such a need, then that's very, very difficult to get money for that. I mean, but to both of you, what actions can the Mayor and the Met take to address under-reporting of VORG incidents, in particular for young people?
Yeah, I mean, I think one recommendation which is really universally supported by violence against women and girls organisations and our members is the call that Sanskriti raised around the firewall between, introducing a firewall between policing and the Home Office, because we know that that's a real barrier for people to come forwards with a worry that they're not going to be treated as victims and survivors, they're going to be treated as potential immigration offenders. And what that, the kind of climate that creates as well for those who are doing the harm, because they know that there's almost a climate of impunity, that if there are certain women that I were to mistreat and abuse, there's nothing they can do about it. And, you know, oftentimes as organisations like Southall Black Sisters will relay, it's, you know, people who are abusing will say to survivors they won't believe you. There was a really high-profile example of David Carrick who used this exact sort of weapon in the case of the abuse of his victims, whereas he was able to say, the police won't believe you, you know, you're not from the UK, there's nothing you can do here. More broadly, in terms of what would increase, I guess, the willingness to report, I mean, some of it is going back to what's been discussed briefly around this culture of victim blaming that we do see within policing. Unfortunately, I mean, there's been so many revelations over recent years around, you know, the Baroness Casey review and Angelini inquiry around what's happening in policing in terms of the treatment of women and misogyny and these things. But I think there is still a long way to go. I think it was just in MOPAC's own data, I was seeing that some of the worst figures we've had in terms of victim satisfaction have just been in the last year. So I think some of the changes we're seeing at a high level within policing, so for example things like Operation Soteria, which is all about changing the way that rape is investigated, I don't think we can say that that's adequately filtered through in terms of ensuring that everyone who comes to report is treated fairly, is treated, you know, is believed, is given the kind of respect that we would hope, and that their rights are upheld as well in terms of the Victims Code. I think part of it as well is also when we're talking about young people, really figuring out, and I think this is something that does feel quite muddled, around what we think the appropriate trauma-informed response would be, because in many cases of police intervention, particularly when we're talking about schools, is not the appropriate route, and what we'd want is referral to specialist services. We're talking about mental health services, we're talking about frontline violence against women and girls services who can give that tailored support, who can look at the issue as one of welfare and safeguarding rather than only as a policing response, which I think sometimes can escalate things and can take things out of the hands of the victim in a way that feels really uncomfortable and quite disempowering as well. They don't get the support, but they do get some investigation which is triggered, and then they're separated in school and things kind of get out of control, and they don't feel like justice has been served in terms of them having the experience that they wanted.
Okay, I'll come to you in a minute, Sunkeet. Can you tell me though, through your experience, what percentage of the perpetrators are family members? As we're just talking about 25 and below.
I mean, we know that the vast majority of abuse will be carried out by someone known to the survivor. In large instances, particularly when we're talking about child sexual abuse, it will be a family member or somebody known to the family. That's come out in various reports from sort of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. I think there's been a focus in recent years, as rightly so, in terms of child sexual exploitation and extrafamilial abuse. But there is so much evidence which is so long-standing that it's the primary site of abuse is the family. And I think that's not necessarily factored into the way in which we do policy and we provide support.
No,
as well.
and it should be.
It should
really.
be.
So if I can ask you, Sunkeet, what do you think that the Mayor, what actions the Mayor and the Met can take?
Yeah, thank you. And just to add to what Janaya was saying, I think in our experience as well, at the moment, the way data is collected for Vogue, it's just not disaggregated by protected characteristics, and that leads to a massive difficulty in identifying disproportionalities. But to give an example of what Janaya was saying, that even in the data that is recorded, there are disproportionalities. There was a survey that was carried out through a Freedom of Information request for 2022 and 2023 figures of black femicide in London, and they found that out of all femicide victims in 2022, 43% of all victims were black, and then in 2023, 62% of all victims were black. And this is when black women make up only 14% of the ethnic female breakdown in London. So you do see them overrepresented as victims, even in the figures that are available. And for us, both in terms of cases that have been reported in the media and what we see at the front line, is that the Met Police does have that culture of heightened disbelief. They do weaponize similar systems as perpetrators. David Carrick weaponized a very similar immigration fear for women as well as perpetrators do, that there's no recourse or no help for you out there, and this was reported at the time. But with the Met, we've also seen evidence of an internal misogynistic culture which came out in spades in the Houghton Learning Report, We've seen their dehumanization of black bodies, even in deaths, like in the cases of Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman taking selfies with their dead bodies. And all of this comes together even in the frontline work that we do. We've had multiple cases where a black victim survivor who is hoping to leave an abusive relationship makes an attempt to do so. The perpetrator calls the police on her, anticipating that, and she's the one who's criminalized. And if she has insecure immigration status, her visa status is reported to immigration enforcement as well. And so for us, something that the Met Police can do, because at the moment there's a great deficit of trust in policing among black, minoritized and migrant communities, and that has been further affected since the Southport riots and the kind of narrative, the alarmist immigrant narrative that has emerged in the aftermath. We think the Met Police can begin by accepting the findings of the Casey Review.
They have, to be fair.
Not the institutional racism bit. They've never accepted that.
That's something separate.
So the findings that we want them to accept is that there is institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia in the police force, and that this does affect the outcomes that black, minoritized and migrant victim survivors receive.
Okay.
That's one for the Met, and I can come on the Mayor if that's helpful.
If you can be brief, we've only got a short time with you relatively, with so much information, if you could keep it slightly shorter.
Sure. For the Mayor, I can just focus on the London Holistic Wraparound Project, the LAVAS project, which is MOPAC funded, and Southall Black Sisters does lead on that project. It has been a vital safety net and supported migrant women with no recourse to public funds and black and minoritized women. Since its inception, over 1,000 women have been supported, and over 500 have received immigration specialism, 700 have received accommodation and subsistence-based support. So it's extremely vital. But there are two issues there at the moment that we're facing with LAVAS. The first is that there's a cliff edge of funding between October 2025 and April 2026. And that 6-month intervening period before the bid goes live in April again, there's an intervening period where black, minoritized and migrant women will not have a service like LAVAS to receive holistic wraparound service. And the other is the LAVAS evaluation in 2022 that pointed out that the Mayor's own initiatives are also limited by the systemic barriers that I was speaking about earlier, including the absence of a firewall and accommodation-based support for women with NRPF.
All right, thank you for that. That's lots for us to think about. We're now going over to Assemblymember Garbutt. Oh, very, very quickly, because we're already late.
No, of course. This is very brief. I'm just struggling to understand. So you talked a lot about minoritized women, but also women with no recourse to public funds. I guess I'm struggling to understand how we can understand those women who are not in either of those two categories, for want of a better phrase, the greater number of women, how your work impacts them. Because I think it would be helpful to get a sense of the whole picture, and it feels a little bit partial at the moment, but I appreciate that might be because of the boundaries of your organisation. So that was just one thing maybe to think about as we go forward. Oh, yeah, the rest of us.
Yeah, no,
I can just come in very quickly on that. We are a specialist by and for service, which means all our staff and all our service users are black, minoritized and migrant. But we do run a national helpline, and there any woman from any ethnicity, any religion, any age, if she were to call, she would be risk assessed and she would be provided assistance with her legal rights and also told where she can go for a specialist service as well. For instance, if she's LGBTQI, we might direct her to Gallup, which is a specialist service for LGBTQI plus women. But for us, our frontline experience will be with black, minoritized and migrant women.
Also very quickly, do you think that you would get a quicker cultural change in the police if you dropped the requirement to accept that they're institutionally racist? Because for them, that presents a problem around their ability to convene with non-white communities. So do you think it'd be better in the long run to drop that?
I think fundamentally, as an organization that represents these communities, we would disagree with that. We think there's been ample evidence, even 30 years ago, with the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson report that followed. It's the same findings. and not accepting institutional racism and backing off from that ask once again seems to put black, minoritized and migrant communities that are receiving in reality tiered support in a place where they're yet again told that they need to concede to certain demands in order to be provided equal service. We don't think that's a negotiation that we should be entering into after years of being let down, particularly at the intersection of identities.
So you don't think it's acting as a barrier for the police to change their culture?
No, we don't think so. In fact, we think that not accepting that allows cases to be individualized and siloed rather than being seen part of a pattern, which they are. And if we were able to place them in that pattern, it would be better to identify the disproportionalities and set measurable outcomes and have independent oversight by protected characteristics.
Thank you. If we can really concentrate on the whole Borg issue as opposed to funding and things like that, because we've got to get a report out of this, specifics. Assemblymember Garbutt.
Thank you for being here today and for the great work from your organisations. Some of this has been touched on before, but just to kind of drill down a bit, the Mayor's current VORG strategy sets out a preventative approach for tackling VORG, arguing that it's not something that we can police our way out of, as a quote. Do you agree with that statement, and what actions do you think the Mayor could be prioritising for policing? I know you have touched on this a bit, but anything extra?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen that as a really positive step in terms of the prioritisation that the Mayor's Office has given to prevention, and recognising that it's going to need sort of a wider, whole society approach, as you might say, that incorporates health, which incorporates education, which incorporates children's social care, etc., rather than policing only. Because I think that's something that's symptomatic of a broader problem, in that we tend to see violence against women and girls as only a Home Office or a justice issue. But when we're talking about how do we stop this from happening so readily, we've got to look more upstream, we've got to look at early education, we've got to look at interventions before we get to a crisis point, or before we get to the point in which harm has already occurred, which I think has been the tendency, and we want to see that shift. In terms of the prioritisation, going back to that VORG strategy, we were very supportive of the kind of behaviour change campaigns that came out in recent years. So for example, the Have a Word campaign, which is thinking about how do we change or attempt to change people's social attitudes towards young women and girls, so we can think about trying to counter some of the more negative influences in social media and access to pornography and so on. So I think that was a really positive step, and we'd really like to have a more kind of sustained, ambitious, multi-year versions of that. As I understand, that was subject to an evaluation, but it's not yet been published, so that would also be a key ask of ours, as to what can we learn from that particular campaign, how can we scale it up across the UK, and see it as something that really tries to shift attitudes overall. I think that the social attitudes point, just to draw it back to young people, I think there might be a tendency sometimes to see this as something that hopefully gets better over time as young people are immersed in RSHE, and as people might have more progressive attitudes towards young women and girls. But on the contrary, some research which is coming out, for example, commissioned by Crown Prosecution Service, found that some of those most worrying views were found in the younger cohorts. This was particularly around what we call rape myths and stereotypes, so ideas about whether women were asking for it, whether if they drink they can give consent, all of these kind of things. It was actually the younger cohort who had the most concerning views rather than the older ones. So I think it really is so much evidence is pointing to the need to bring it downstream and to think about early intervention. I think there's a contradiction there in some ways when we talk about early intervention and then what the police can do, because often the police are coming in at a later stage. There are programmes like Operation Encompass, which is around notifying schools when there's a case of domestic abuse. So if police are called to a household of domestic abuse, they can contact the school to ensure that there's some sort of welfare and support provided for the child at school. But then we often come up against what resources and capacity did the school have to do anything about it? Are there resources there for CAMS? Are there resources there for special services? Because the notification happens, and oftentimes that doesn't necessarily lead to a better outcome for the child. So yeah, hopefully that's answered the question in terms of, I think it's trying to figure out that balance. If we want to do prevention, early intervention, it's not always going to be a policing response. To add to that, I mean, we've been quite critical of the rollout of Safer Schools officers within education. It feels like there's quite question mark around the evidence base for that, and we know that some of the outcomes for, as we students, but also minoritized students, isn't great. We think that the kind of work in terms of delivering education in schools and doing workshops is better held by the specialist violence against women and girls services or by the teachers rather than police. So I'd add that as well.
Organisations that really mirrored that thought yesterday. Santaviti, do you have anything to add?
I think it's a very quick addition. I think Jania has covered most of it. But we really welcomed some of the initiatives that the Mayor's taken specifically for young girls. So Courageous is one of those. It supports 14 to 24-year-old girls, and Southall Black Sisters does deliver service under the Courageous model as well. And even under LAVAS, we mainly supported single young women for whom there's a gap otherwise in adult safeguarding services as well. And that's something we really welcome. But there's definitely more funding that's needed. If this helps, we recently did a research piece called Investing in Safety. And Investing in Safety was robust financial modelling on what specialist bar and force services save for the state across policing, children's social care, NHS, and we found that per woman over the 3-year period, which is when local commissioners commission services, there's a saving of over £18,000 per woman across these 5 public service areas, especially when they're black, minoritized and migrant with no recourse and have very limited support services. And so scale nationally, taking the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's figures, that there are 32,000 victim survivors with NRPF that report a year in all likelihood, and 7,000 of them require accommodation-based support. Scale nationally, savings would be over £127 million for a 3-year period per cohort. And we think that needs to be factored into the way that funding is ring-fenced, long-term and sustainable for bar and force services. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner has also in the spending review suggested that it should be at least 63.5 million that's ring-fenced for bar and force services.
Thanks, Chair.
Assemblymember Best.
I just want to come back to the point you made around safer schools officers and not believing they were the right people to deliver that work. I have to say, I fundamentally disagree. I think that's that they should be in those classrooms building those positive relationships. But you did say about it should be specialist services. So have you worked with local officers or any Met officers to see if you can go in with them and deliver a co-designed service?
Yeah, well, I think some of on the point around whether they are the appropriate authority or body to be there, I think part of the scepticism around it is just we don't have the evidence. So I think it's something that's been rolled out and kind of ramped up over recent years with some worrying evidence around the impact of it for, as we said, black and minoritized survivors, but without the accompanying evidence to say, but this is how we know that it works and that it works well for all children. So I think in terms of that's a really important part of police practice, is building those relationships with local specialist violence against women and girls services. And it happens in pockets of areas, but not universally. So in terms of that question around whether specialist drug services and police would have that relationship, in many cases, no. We would think it would be the onus. We would expect the police to be reaching out to understand what the picture of services is in that area, so that if they're doing that work, they can do that well.
But perhaps if you're waiting for the phone to ring and they're waiting for the phone to ring, that there's a bridge that needs to be crossed, because perhaps the compromise position here, it seems to me, is that a co-designed service between specialist services and officers may be a better outcome. Even if you don't believe it's the best outcome.
Yeah, of course, that would, whichever way or whichever format is rolled out, I think that the key thing is that it's subject to an evidence base and we can see how it impacts on all children and if it's what children want.
I wanted to ask about how you both believe the Mayor should work with young people to better understand their experience of VAUG.
Yeah, I can say. Yeah, I think there's been some good work done in terms of engaging with young people overall in terms of violence reduction. I understand there's the YPAG, the Young People's Action Group, but I think there's been less done to date with specifically looking at young women and girls' experiences. So I think that's certainly something that could be built on, whether that's a sort of violence against women and girls group, to think about the ways in which the experience of violence is a gendered phenomenon and what it means. Because this is something we've heard as well when talking to our members across the board around the work in London, is it's been a challenge sometimes, I think, it's sometimes felt like a bit of an afterthought in terms of the broader violence reduction strategies also meaning violence against women and girls within that. So really to integrate that work together, and I think part of doing that would be to bring more young women and girls into the kind of consultation groups or the advisor groups that the Mayor's Office already has.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that. And I think, so I've been here for over a year now, and so far we haven't had engagement with victim survivors with the Mayor's Office, and I think that would really inform strategy where victim survivors can come forward and co-produce and have their voices heard. And of course, that would require certain accommodations to be made for migrant victim survivors with no recourse to public funds. Any engagement, for instance, that we've done with the Home Office in the recent past on this has been with allowing anonymity for these victim survivors, not having to reveal any identifying details. But these kinds of focus groups would be really useful. And then we also sit on a few working groups or task forces where there's the opportunity to discuss frontline concerns and frontline trends that we're seeing, and that would be good to discuss in the context of London with the Mayor's Office as well. And again, frontline services, including Buy-in-For services, could bring in the voices of the victim survivors, the young girls that they're providing service to between 14 to 24 years of age, and have that inform the strategy as well.
But the action plan for tackling violence against women and girls was published in December 2023, and as part of that, there was a promise to publish an engagement plan for London in collaboration with the Vogue sector, which will use a range of methods to hear Londoners' views and shape the Met's Vogue response and understand its impact. From what you're both saying, you haven't that engagement strategy hasn't been published, and from what it sounds like, you haven't had any conversations with the Mayor's Office about that coming forward.
So EVOR as an organisation has had engagement with those plans, but in terms of the frontline Vogue services, so our members, I don't think the engagement has been as extensive as with the broader sort of violence reduction or youth violence issues, and particularly in terms of how there could be sort of an ongoing advisory group in the same way that there's YPAG, which includes young women and girls. So not in a sort of consultation way for a plan, but that's something that's kind of shaping the work over the course of time.
So your views on the engagement plan have been sought either formally or informally?
Yeah. So EVOR as an organisation, but I guess the distinction is because we carry out policy and campaigns work, but we don't deliver frontline services, so we have slightly more capacity than a lot of our members to engage with the likes of the VRU, and with national government as well. But in terms of the services and the services that are supporting young women and girls, I think there'd be much less.
So I suppose if you've had your views sought on that, I guess, do you have any idea if it's close to being formally completed or published yet, or was it early stages?
The last we heard was that there was a young women and girls plan that we were waiting to come to the VRU, but I don't think we've seen that.
Haven't had this engagement. If there was any prior to my time, it hasn't been ongoing then, so we haven't had any updates, at least since I've joined.
I think if we could seek maybe a confirmation when that engagement plan will come. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. This is a question to both of you, Khaled. So what are the key priorities to prevent and support young people experiencing violence against women and girls should the Mayor include in his upcoming refreshed Vogue strategy?
Yes, I think one of those I've listed already, I think would be really building on the work with the kind of behaviour change campaign. I think that would be a key priority to take forward and to make sure that it's the evaluations are published, and following that there's more widespread rollout to ensure that more of an audience is reached. I think building on the work that's started in schools, I think you'll hear from panel 2 from Tender and other organisations who are delivering work within London. I think that is another key priority. From what we hear, that there's been some back and forth around the question of relationships or RSHE guidance and what it is that teachers should be engaging with young people in schools. There's a real question around teacher confidence in terms of delivery of that work. And there's also just the context in which schools are operating in terms of competing priorities. So I think really trying to support teachers, support those specialist services to do the work in schools in a way that is really sort of integrated throughout not only the curriculum but the entire school would be a big priority for us. I think there's something to be said as well around expanding some of that to sort of alternative provision and SEND schools as well, because that's something that often comes up as a gap, and where we know that there's a high risk as well for victimisation.
Thank you. I think for us there would be a set of national priorities and a set of local priorities. So the national priorities very quickly would be for the Mayor to publicly continue supporting any work around migrant victim survivors policy reforms, around the extension of the MVDAC DVILR to all victim survivors regardless of immigration status, and the installation of a firewall between the police and immigration enforcement. Lavas has, through its practice, done this quite a fair bit since its inception, so we would want to see that support continue. And on a local basis, we would really welcome if the work strategy prioritised the Mayor's work on pushing local councils in London to comply with their duties under Section 17 of the Children Act to provide safeguarding responsibilities to women with children, again, regardless of their immigration status. And what we would really welcome is that legal aid cuts and austerity have quite depleted any kind of access to legal advice that women can have. And that's something quite key because many of them need to make specialist applications like child contact arrangement orders. They need assistance with financial remedies on divorce, not to mention the criminal cases themselves if they decide to engage with the criminal justice system. So we would really welcome a flagship project that looks at bridging the gap that at the moment we can't foresee being bridged in any other way unless there is funding provided specifically for independent legal advice for women and girls. So those would be our local priorities, along with working with the police and funding, which I've already spoken about.
In comparison with the current strategy, do you think that in the emerging strategy there should be greater emphasis given to protections against online harms?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for raising that point. I understand that there has been, the VRU has set up a sort of steering group around online harms and is considering, or is in the early stages of doing some research around the connection between online and offline violence. I think it's a tricky question in the sense of, in our view, some of the levers there sit with national government in terms of regulation and legislation and how far the Online Safety Act allows us to go in terms of what the tech platforms themselves are doing. But certainly I think just ensuring that throughout the strategy there is an understanding of the way in which online and offline violence are often interwoven, and also what it means for those who are doing the work in schools in terms of having the capacity and the skills and the resource to be able to ensure that there's an element which considers online. We've heard from many of our services that they don't have the same, for example, Women and Girls Network, who deliver brilliant work within London. Being able to do prevention work around online violence against women and girls in particular is quite challenging with the current sort of capacity and resources that they have. So I think building on that is a very good suggestion.
Yes, I agree as well. And I think what we're seeing at the front line is that particularly for young girls, again, the way we define it between 14 to 24 years of age, tech-facilitated domestic abuse is very, very common. It's becoming a primary tool of furthering abuse. And for these women, again, it intersects with forms of abuse like honor-based abuse, where the perpetrator will not just threaten to release an intimate image, but will also threaten to then release it to her community through WhatsApp groups and cause it to become a cause of her shunning. And so, again, because both of these are forms of abuse that aren't as well understood and aren't as well risk assessed by the police in particular, there's an aggravation, again, for women and girls who face specialized forms of abuse like honor-based abuse. So those intersectional needs need to be accounted for as well in looking at any kind of online harms. And the police as well, it would be great if they would take accountability, again, in any way or form for furthering these cases, because at the front line we try and get police support on getting these images taken down, but we haven't been very successful. And that then again imposes a burden on us to put it in their safety plans, and something that we don't prefer doing is isolating them further from their networks of support. But in the absence of any kind of action being taken, if there are images that might re-trigger them, we definitely have to include social media in their safety planning as well. So it would be good if these intersectional experiences could be included as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, coming on to our second section, some of these questions have lightly been touched on, colleagues, so if you don't need to ask it, please don't. We're up against the clock. We'll start this section with Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Good morning again. What support is available to young girls who are at risk from group-based child sexual exploitation in London?
I can go first. So, to our knowledge, we don't know of any state-based support specifically for any victim survivors of child sexual exploitation, group-based in nature. We do know of a few specialist services, so Safer London, Gallup in the case of LGBTQIA+ victim survivors, they do work on these issues. But for us, I think this is more a fundamental issue. What we're seeing at our frontline service is that the way the narrative has emerged around group-based child sexual exploitation has also led to a certain essentialist idea of who a perpetrator is and who a victim is and what ethnicity they come from. And that has led to undergrounding or hidden victims that come from other communities and other ethnicities. And so for us, this has also been about reassuring victim survivors that come to us that perpetrators and victim survivors cut across demographics like culture, age, ethnicity. And again, that's where I think specialist buy-in-for services are having to really work with victims to find out if they're hidden victims of child sexual exploitation as well. So we don't know of any state-based support.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we just hear that it's quite inconsistent in terms of the support available for those subject to sort of group-based child sexual exploitation across boroughs. I know that there are organisations like Avianda and Youth Realities who are doing work in London, but I think the picture is quite patchy, and I think there's a question mark as well because we do have the London Survivors Gateway, which is sort of a route to support for anyone who's experienced sexual violence of any form, but its kind of eligibility is from 13 and over, so then there's a cohort of others under that age group who wouldn't be eligible, so it's really tricky.
Do we have any idea of the scale of this? Is it a particular problem, or is it just in the basket of challenges that we have? Do we have any idea of the scale?
Not hugely, not London specific. Again, it goes back to that question in terms of the not having that strategic needs assessment of all forms of org in London. So we have sort of indicators of it in terms of the demand that the services that do exist are saying we're not unable to support survivors at age 11 who come to us, or our waiting lists are huge, or we can only do crisis support, we can't do longer term support. But we don't have that overall picture in the way that we would like, and that's something that we think was really important.
I suppose it leads me to the question, do you think it would be useful, necessary to look into it, to investigate, to understand the scale, the nature, if it exists at all? You made a point about that essentialist view that is particular communities, etc. Because my worry is the community cohesion. You know, you walk around, on the ground, it doesn't feel that one particular community has to own it, but if we can't answer the question, it could become that. So what do you think, would an inquiry be useful, and where would you put some of that emphasis?
I think in terms of what we're hearing from frontline services, particularly sexual violence services, around the question of like a national inquiry, is a sense that there's been a series of kind of inquiries and recommendations which have taken a lot of time and a lot of sort of expectation of survivors too. And those recommendations haven't yet been implemented. So the perspective we're hearing from your sort of rape crisis service and so on is let's get the action on the recommendations that have already been put forward over successive inquiries, and let's get the movement there, at least before we start talking about another inquiry in which victims and survivors are then having to wait a longer period to find out the conclusions of that to get the support that we know is so desperately needed.
My focus would be on a London inquiry, so because we've had our traditional problems, challenges, I want to use those words, with the Met. We probably face the county lines drama far more than any other part of the country, so we have our own particular problems, just the sheer scale of London. So I'm particularly focused on what is going on here in London, if only so we can go back and reassure our communities. And I wonder if a London inquiry, because it wouldn't be looking to change the law, it might be looking to change how we operate, because that would happen more quickly, I imagine. So that's the focus. So do you think that would be useful?
I think my question would be, I guess, how would you see that as differing from a broader strategy which is looking to find out the prevalence of all forms of violence against women and girls, which would incorporate child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation, to give us, as we've been saying, that sort of basis for action to say this is the scale of what we're looking at London overall, especially because when we look at things like child sexual exploitation, it often overlaps with other forms of abuse, whether that's domestic abuse or rape. So I think there'd be a need to explore why would we single that out as a particular element that we want to explore when the picture feels so patchy across the board.
I might answer that question because it will use our time, but I do have an answer actually. But please, if you have an addition.
I think we'd agree with that. I think we definitely question why we're singling out a particular form of abuse, and rather than looking at the basis for need all across WOG, all across London. So I think it would be very similar to Evo's position.
Chair, back to you.
Thank you. For the interest of time, I won't ask my question and go straight to Assemblymember Roberts.
Thank you. This is a question for Senator Greeted. It's regarding the support services commissioned by MOPAC and the VRU for young women and girls from minoritized communities. How accessible do you think they are, and what aspects would you like to see improved?
Thank you. I think, again, I've spoken a bit about this. The two that we have definitely benefited from and that the victim survivors that we support have benefited from are Courageous and Lavas. They both have really prioritized intersectional needs. They're both focused on Black, minoritized and migrant victim survivors. And in that sense, they're quite tailored as well to working with specialist services, so they align with our asks quite generally. And like I said, particularly under Lavas, the one thing that it recognizes that many other funding programs don't is the need for a wraparound holistic service. So if we were to look at it in comparison to the other really big project, which is the Home Office funded Support for Migrant Victims scheme, again, I think both of them are similar in that they can provide accommodation and subsistence-based support. The SMV is, of course, larger because it's national. It can support about 450 victim survivors a year. And then the Lavas supports approximately 30 to 40, as per my knowledge, and since its inception has supported about 1,000 victim survivors. But in the SMV, a lot of the wraparound support is entirely out-of-pocket costs for us, so counselling, group-based support, which is the only peer network that many of these women have, ESOL or English language classes that they need. But under Lavas, we've been able to include that support as part of the service that we deliver, and we would continue wanting to see that. But I think the shortcomings at the same time is that there's a massive gap between demand and provision. So under Courageous, we support about 21 young girls a year, but a lot more present to our service. And then again, we need to look for other funding pots where we can provide them service through. And it's similar for Lavas as it's similar for the SMV as well, because as we've spoken, the DAC would place victim survivors at 32,000 and 7,000 requiring accommodation and subsistence-based support. So those are the broad funding patterns that we've benefited from, but we would also really welcome safeguarding schemes that sit under the Mayor's remit, for instance, from Transport for London. We know that for young girls up till 16, transport is free, and what we see is that girls who are escaping abuse at a young age suddenly find it very difficult to afford public transport as soon as they no longer have that free provision, because, for instance, if they're under the SMV, they're getting £60 a week, and they need to get their food in that, their sanitaries, and any transport, etc. So it's definitely something that it's very difficult for them to afford once they turn 16. So any safeguarding schemes that recognize those needs and their cash dependence, because again, many of these girls have trouble accessing independent bank accounts, and buses don't accept cash, for instance. So that's again something that we would welcome some conversation on with frontline teams.
So yeah, I was just going to add, before we move on, in terms of the question for accessibility, just that one of the issues been raised by one of our members, Stay Safe East, to support disabled survivors, is around the need for more provision for wheelchair accessible refuge spaces within London. They say that within their commissioned services there's only 15 wheelchair accessible units, and obviously there's no guarantee that that space will be available when someone needs it. So I think that's a gap that we'd like to see addressed as well.
Good point. Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Before I move on, an awful lot of the conversation, Sangriti, has been about funding. Would you like to write to us after this to say where you think there are gaps in funding so that we can concentrate on the actual what's being done, because we've only got 10 minutes left, so I'd be really grateful, and we'd be very happy to receive any comments from you around things that need funding. Assemblymember Garbutt.
Thanks. just to follow on from the conversation, I'm just interested if there's enough support for young LGBTIQA plus victims and survivors of VAUG. And also I'm interested in the concern, how we hear the concerns from care experienced children. Just if you could speak to those.
Yeah, I think definitely that would be an area in which we'd like to see more provision, is around for the support for LGBT survivors. There are services like Gallup who provide support and advice and sort of counselling for that group, but I think they, the kind of feedback that we hear from Gallup was just around whether that feels like it's properly implemented or reflected within the broader violence against women and girls strategies, and whether there's a recognition, I guess, of the particular experiences of LGBT survivors, including sort of forms of so-called conversion therapy, and also just the particular circumstances in which sort of being outed within a family can have grave consequences in terms of their access to resources and housing, and just their wider peer groups as well. So I think there's that's something we'd support in terms of there being more consideration within a VAUG strategy to make sure that that improves in future years.
Nothing much to add to that.
I haven't directly heard anything on care experience, but I'm happy to check in with our members on that.
Yes.
Through the call for
Certainly a good
evidence.
idea, thank you.
Yeah.
That's
Lord Bailey.
number 12.
What impact has the adultification bias had on black girls and young women seeking help and support when experiencing violence? And what more needs to be done? That question makes an assumption that there is an adultification. I'm struggling with that word. I think we all accept that. But what else needs to be done? My belief is that culture outperforms policy every single time, but just as a personal belief. But what else do you think could be done to help the police develop this? Because I believe they want to, but how can we help them?
Yeah, that's something that we've heard quite a lot in terms of when engaging with our members around the experiences of black young women and girls when engaging, whether within school or with policing or statutory services. How it shows up, I think, is, I guess, a failure for authorities to recognise a trauma response and to perceive that in quite racialised ways, so perceiving black young women and girls as aggressive or troublemakers, or kind of putting the onus of the problem on the survivor themselves rather than recognising that this behaviour might be an indication that something's wrong. I guess it goes back to some of the conversation earlier around school and policing. Is there's again an organisation called Women and Girls Network has talked about the quite punitive responses to black young women and girls in schools, so them being received or treated as potentially the aggressor within situations when they respond to violence against women and girls, being at risk of things like exclusion, or in recent data, because we know that boys are more likely to be permanent exclusions, it's some of the hidden behaviours, sort of managed moves within schools, so whether they're separated from peers or isolated as a way to kind of contain the problem, and that's the problem sitting with the black young woman or girl who's been victimised, rather than having a more trauma-informed approach, which is saying what's going on here, this is a young person who we have sort of safeguarding welfare duties to. And I think that the intersection there with policing, obviously we've seen in the most extreme cases of child Q in recent years where someone was strip searched within school. I think it's that crossover in which the adultification of young women and girls means that they are not given the kind of rights to support that other victims of girls would hope for, but also don't get. But as we know, that there's a disproportionality there. I think in the recent figures from the VRU, which I don't think are published as yet, there's been a slight increase in sort of females regarded as suspects rather than victims. And I think there could be something to explore there as well in terms of what's also coming from services about how young black women and girls are regarded and treated.
And could you add into your answer as well anything about the cultural piece? Because we all know people make assumptions about other people's culture. What I'm interested in is how do we teach that? How do we encourage the police? How do we support them to change that? Are we asking for police directly from that culture, or is there enough education out there so anybody could learn enough of somebody's culture to provide a proper gateway? What's the approach you would like to see?
Thank you. I think to very briefly add to what Janaya was saying, I think what it also does in the way that these harmful racist stereotypes will manifest. We've had multiple instances being told to us where young girls have been told, you're a strong black woman, so you don't need the support, or you're an angry black woman, so you must have caused it, and hence the retaliation. I think what all of this does, other than the impact of obscuring their experiences or of presumptively criminalizing them, is that it also causes them to constantly police their actions and emotions in the way that they're living their lives. And of course, this means that very often their safeguarding risks aren't identified, and they don't feel comfortable discussing those with people in trusted positions either. But from a culture perspective, and that's the question that you asked after, something that we've always been calling for on this front is that police need to work with buy-in force services that have that kind of specialist knowledge of what communities want, that put victim survivors first. And that's something that we don't think can be taught in a single training period, of course, but we think that training needs to be on an ongoing basis. It needs to be periodically refreshed, but it would be good to start working with buy-in force services in the first instance. And then I think a key piece here for policing is also to listen to black and minoritized officers within the force. We've recently seen the National Black Police Association come out on the Police Race Action Plan. This was quite a few months back, and at that time they were calling the Police Race Action Plan out for not actively listening to the way that black communities are being treated within the police force themselves. So it also has to do with internal culture, which is something that external organizations can't challenge effectively enough and work with them on. We can only work with them on the experiences that we have with victim survivors. So there's a piece there for listening to officers within as well, and making those discussions quite public as well, because the communities within police forces from black, minoritized and migrant communities represent concerns that are shared outside as well.
Just quickly, you're obviously specialists for black and minoritized communities, but the failings that happened also happened to white girls as well. And is there a class element here? If you don't have parents, period, or the nice middle-class parents who can explain things and know who to write that letter to. So are they suffering from the same experience? Because I used to be a youth worker, I still work for several youth charities, and a white girl gave me a very horrific story, and nobody could say it was because of her race, but it felt to me it's because of her class.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that goes back to, I think there's a broader problem in the sense of there's an understanding when we talk about victims and survivors of violence against women and girls, that I think that often falls on quite a stereotype of what an ideal victim looks like. So maybe she's passive, maybe she's distressed, maybe she presents in a particular way, maybe she articulates herself in a particular way or advocates for herself. But I think for those who fall outside of that, I mean, even though survivors won't always get the treatment they should, but I think there are definitely elements in which I guess it's kind of discrimination and bias come in, whether that's based on her working class background or her ethnicity or her disability. So yeah, absolutely, I think that it's class can be a factor, and I think it's going back to the case of Rochdale and the way in which some of the victims and survivors were regarded and dismissed and perceived as kind of bring it on themselves is all part of the picture in terms of the broader victim blaming culture that we see across society.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're really running out of time. Assembly Member Moema.
So to both of you, you've mentioned, Sanskriti, that you're able to only support 21 girls per year in one of your programmes. So my question is to really ask you whether support services for young women and girls who are victims of sexual assault, if their needs are being met, if we're able to meet that demand, and whether or not you think MOPAC and VRU services are delivering sufficiently. And I guess, as the Chair said, kind of independent of funding issues, what the actual kind of service on the ground is.
Thank you. I think just to comment very briefly on that, for us the experience is that demand always outpaces the provision that's made. So what that does in reality on services like ours is that we obviously want to support as many victim survivors as we can. So it's about trying to support victim survivors under as many funding pots as we can. So it becomes a patchwork of provision more than it does about just gaps in provision. But there are gaps because it's a patchwork like a mosaic. And those gaps have to be filled by us in any way that we can, in the way that I spoke about. We'd cover certain parts of their support under a funding pot, and then the rest would be out of pocket for us. That again, we would have to try and find other funds needs for. So it's just that patchwork that needs to be spoken about. And then I think when we talk about, I think it's about returning right where we started, that there are many victim survivors of sexual assault that aren't even being able to come forward. And so the demand that we're even seeing is probably just, it's a fraction of what the actual demand is, because structural barriers are preventing women from coming forward in the first place. And so that goes to the issue of underreporting as well that we were discussing earlier, that especially migrant women, for instance, with insecure immigration status, would not be reflected in any statistics because it's very unlikely that they're coming forward at all. And their invisibilization needs to be factored into what more needs to be done. And how they need to be supported as well. So are they explicitly included in that funding pot? What are the reporting requirements like? Because, for instance, we would have hesitance reporting under any projects where immigration status is required when they have insecure immigration status. So it just becomes about thinking about what that support service looks like when victim survivors are being invisibilized.
Thank you. The question, I think, to add to I think the question is around what support is available. I think there are, as I've mentioned before, that there are routes to support through the London Survivors Gateway, but as I understand, that's operating at peak demand. I just checked the website yesterday and all online referrals have been stopped because of the extent to which that service is under demand. So I think there's a huge gap between what is needed and what provision is available. Obviously, there are brilliant services for those who can reach them in terms of sort of rape crisis centres. And one of the key things that often comes up in terms of what survivors want is around access to counselling and mental health support. The waiting lists for those are pretty huge, and I think there's a crossover there with the, I guess, the picture as well for child and adolescent mental health services, because there's some services reporting that the kind of level of complex mental health needs is growing. But whether that can be held within specialist VORG services when CAM's sort of waiting lists are at maximum is a real challenge. And I think the other thing, maybe just to, I know we haven't raised here today, that might play into all of the discussion around data and reporting and demand is just the government's announcement that it intends to bring in a duty around mandatory reporting within the Police and Crime Bill. And what impact that might have across the board in terms of the volume of reports that might come in with the new criminal offence, what that will mean for specialist services, what that will mean for authorities, and what that will mean for the picture overall. I think it's really something we're trying to consider with our member services as well in terms of how to prepare for that. I think it's...
Okay. Thank you. And then just really my final question. In our briefing, there's kind of a piece which suggests, and would like to get your view on this, we'll start with Janaya, that one of the issues is that violence within the VRU and perhaps MOPAC, violence and youth, the police as well, but violence and youth violence have greater engagement than frontline VORG services. And I suppose if you're backing away, it could feel like serious violence, kind of stabbings, knife crime and so on, is focused around boys, basically, and young men. And VORG services, a bit of a Cinderella service, are focused around women and young women and girls. And I just wonder what your views are on how to level that so that we see more of each in each of those services, so they're not basically end up accidentally being separated by sex. Those two focuses for the police. Well, they focus on knife crime, rightly, but less so on violence against women and girls.
I think that's a really important point. I think we would agree, I guess, with the premise around the difficulty in the way in which they are separated, because I think, as you've set out, within youth violence, the risks are overlapping. So, for example, girls who are associated with gangs and at risk of criminal exploitation are also at risk of sexual exploitation, and what the support is that for them there. But even when thinking about knife crime, a proportion of knife crime will be from violence against women and girls with a knife as a weapon. I think there's been some steps taken in recent years, even our role as an organisation, our engagement with the Violence Reduction Unit has been part of the attempt to try and bridge some of that gap. But I wouldn't say that it's necessarily, from what we hear from services, it doesn't feel as though that's integrated across service provision, and that there does tend to have that separation between youth violence is an issue for boys and violence against women and girls is an issue for girls over here, rather than seeing the ways, as you've said, that they overlap. So I think that's a really important factor.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And the last quick question from Assembly Member Best.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be quick. I do have 2 questions, so if you can try and do them quickly, that'd be helpful. The Mayor launched, I think it was last year now, the MATE campaign of calling it out. I think that campaign it looks like it's finished now. If there was another campaign that tried to do something like that, what is the learning from that you think should be different this time, or do you think that hit the mark?
I think from EVO's perspective, there are a lot of things that were done quite well, even in terms of having the target audience be boys and young men, and thinking about how we can encourage them to intervene in a way which feels safe and acceptable. Yeah, I think over many years, I think violence against women and girls has been something that is perceived as that's something for girls and women to deal with, rather than that's something that others can intervene on. I think there could have been a bit more stakeholder engagement with violence against women and girls organisations at an earlier stage. And I think another thing that was done well was trying to involve some sort of figures, you know, whether it's footballers or influencers or social media comedians, for example, within the campaign itself, to think about how to make this something which is relatable and understandable. But as I said, we've not, about the evaluation of that hasn't been made public, so I think there's a lot there that we would like to build from and see more of, but once it's made public.
Yeah, nothing perfect. And because my last question, we heard evidence here from a service provider saying that it felt sometimes like with all commissioned services, it can feel a bit like flavour of the month. And obviously we see that with the VIU, there's a load of difference. That could be for very good reason and specialists, but does it feel like that to you, or do you think that the way in which the VIU is commissioning and continuing to roll out services is done in the right way?
I'm not sure. I don't know if I'd know enough to say whether within the VRU specifically is you can feel the sense of the flavour of the month. I would say, I guess, at a national level, you can get the sense that when a particular form of war makes the news, or unfortunately after the worst case happens and there's a murder, there's a flurry of action. And I think that, I guess, takes us back to why we want to kind of go back to the root causes of this issue and look at how do we stop this from happening in the first place, rather than having policy or practice or funding be based on the flavour of the day, as you said, because, yeah, whether it is CSA or CSE, we know that all of these forms of violence against women and girls interconnect, and unfortunately they're incredibly prevalent, so I think it's trying to do the best we can for everyone.
Yeah, I think just very quickly to add on that, I would have to say very similarly that I can't speak specifically to the VRU, but on a national scale, I think it's very similar. Our perspective is that when a certain kind of crime type takes prominence, there's an immediate reaction to that, but it's a stopgap because very soon there's a move on to the next issue and then the next issue, and it's all being isolated rather than being seen again as part of the pattern that it is. And what's also important to recognize is that in the absence of services that work, especially statutory services that work for women and girls, they remain at a very precarious risk of being trapped in endless cycles of abuse and exploitation. So it might be that what has come to prominence today, there's a different crime type that they're now going on to because they weren't provided the tailored support and service that they need. And I think that isn't adequately recognized in the way that support services are funded and commissioned.
Okay, thank you. Ladies, I'm sorry we've been a bit rushed, because I'm sure everybody on the committee will agree we could have spoken to you all morning. Fascinating stuff. Thank you very much, and thank you for attending. We will now adjourn, colleagues, until 11:30, and we will start probably at 11:30 for the second stage. Thank you. To the London Assembly's Police and Crime Committee. I would like to welcome our second panel of guests, Kate Lexon, Director of Services for Tender, Ellie Softly, Head of Education and Facilitation, everyone's invited, and Professor Jessica Ringrose, Co-Director, Centre for Sociology of Education and Equity, University College of London. So good morning and thank you for coming. I'm going to start the questions off. And this is to all of you. So why is it so important to educate young people in preventing and reducing VAUG in London, and what more needs to be done? So shall I start that way? Kate, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, the statistics are huge in terms of why prevention is necessary. We know that 16 to 25-year-olds are the most at risk of unhealthy behaviours in relationships. We know that sexual harassment is rife, and I'm sure Ellie will talk about that a bit later on in terms of the work that Everyone's Invited does. We know that children and young people feel worried within their school settings. So there's a statistic around, I think it's around 50% of children and young people feel nervous of violence happening or violence having had happened within their school settings. So we know that there's a huge problem, and it was talked about in the previous panel as well. And we know that prevention education is the way that we need to tackle this problem. So when I'm talking about prevention education, I'm talking about early primary prevention, so stopping it happening before it starts. And the way that we know works best, so Tender has been delivering prevention education for over 20 years. This is our specialism, this is our core area of work. And we know that what works is teaching children and young people about skills that they can take into their future relationships. So skills around consent, around healthy behaviours in relationships, around what constitutes people's rights in relationships, what unhealthy behaviours are, early warning signs of unhealthy behaviours, where to seek support. So all of these are conversations that we can and should be having really early on, from primary school upwards, to equip children and young people with those skills to be able to prevent abuse. So fundamentally, that's where Tender's coming from in terms of the importance of prevention education and why it can work. And I'm sure the others will have things to feed in as well.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I mean, preventative education is absolutely crucial. There's such a wide range of statistics. I'd just like to underscore the fact that it's not just children. There's been some really important surveys of teachers' experiences of misogyny in schools as well, with one report from the TES finding 1 in 4 female secondary school teachers have been sexually harassed or abused over the previous 12 months. That was in 2021. A 2022 poll by NASUWT Teachers Union found that 58% of women staff in school had experienced misogyny from pupils, but 45% from the senior management team and 42% from other teachers. And so these statistics are really important to take into account, that this is a culture-wide, society-wide issue affecting the adults and those people that are caretaking of young people, as well as the young people themselves, and that sort of preventative education needs to happen in a whole school approach, which I'm sure we would all advocate for, in terms of creating a safe environment for teachers, the right education for teachers, and so that enables them to have the skills to also impart to young people. So I just wanted to sort of bring into light the entire, because I work in education, the entire sector and schooling, and of course we need high quality RSE, which we will probably be discussing, but I just wanted to bring those statistics to the table to start off.
Thank you so much for having me here today, first of all, and good morning to all of you. I think to focus on the question of why preventative education is so essential, the story of Everyone's Invited and our origins really encapsulates that. So Everyone's Invited is a registered charity now, but we started as a grassroots movement online after our founder and CEO, Soma Sara, shared her experience of sexual abuse during her time at school. After she shared her experience online, it essentially opened the floodgates for other young people to do the same thing and to talk about their experiences at school. And in March of 2021, we had 50,000 anonymous submissions onto our website. We are still getting submissions every single week. We've got 10,000 in backlog that we're working through. And essentially, young people are crying out for education. They're they need help, they need support. And across the board, every single time we go to a school, they're saying, you're here too late. You've got here too late. I needed this way before this point in time. And Ofsted did a review into sexual abuse in schools off the back of our campaign and movement. And I want to share some of the stats from that. So 90% of girls and 50% of boys said that they received explicit pictures or videos of things that they did not want to see a lot or sometimes. And 40% of 13 to 15-year-olds said unwanted touching occurred a lot or sometimes. Now, we share these statistics with students that we work with from Year 7 upwards. We've had an education programme now for the last 3 years. We've worked with over 50,000 students. And we share these statistics with them, and we ask them to raise their hands if these statistics surprise them. And this is down to 11 years old. 99% of the time, not a single student raises their hand. This is what is happening. It is the context of their experiences and their relationships. And that is why that prevention is so key, especially now when, rape culture is thriving in our society, but it really takes root in schools. And it's infiltrating the classroom at such a younger age and such a terrifying rate because of the digital landscape. We spoke to a teacher last week who works with Year 4 students, so that's around 9 years old. She said that 25 out of 30 of her students had access to TikTok. 25 out of 30. And if that's where they're hearing at that age about sex and relationships first, we're getting there almost sometimes 10 years later or 5 years later than what those experiences are online. And we've got suggestions of kind of what we can do to counter that, but I'll pass it back to you as to not take up too much time.
By what I've been hearing this morning, and some of those statistics are shocking. The one thing I rarely hear in any conversations about any of this, though, is parents. Now, is that old-fashioned of me to think that is, the onus keeps getting put on everybody but the parents. So is any work, briefly, obviously, because I've put this question as an extra, but, is any work being done with parents to get them to talk to their children? Because...
Can I jump in here, if that's okay? So one of my biggest points is parental engagement, and it's been it's so difficult, parental engagement. We ran a session with a school with 900 students, not a single parent showed up. We offer our parent sessions for free, completely for free for every school to take on, and we do get parents turning up, but there is such a disconnect between what parents think are happening in their kids' lives and the reality of what is happening. There has never been a larger generational gap than there is right now. And parents are not digitally literate, but they're not trying to be either. So, for example, a school that we were at last month in London, the head teacher told us that she'd been running digital literacy sessions for her younger students at the school, and a parent came in and complained about them and said, well, my son doesn't really go on the computer, he's not really allowed on his phone, he doesn't really know about any of this stuff, so why are you giving him this education? And that head teacher told me that that's the student that they go to help them with their IT problems at school. So that complete lack of just awareness over what is going on. But, our most taken up session, although we only get 1 or 2 parents show up, is our parent sessions where they just want us to sit and tell them what their kids are seeing on their phones. And when their faces, when you show them what they might have access to, it's like their minds have been completely blown. So really, parental engagement is at the forefront of what we're pushing now is, going to banks, mass employers, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, and asking them to bring that training in so that they can do it within working hours, so that parents who are overworked and overstretched, who can't make those sessions, have that opportunity. That's what we would really like to see.
So do you think this is a blip? Because things like TikTok and such Instagram, etc., are relatively recent. So do you think when this generation of youngsters become parents, they'll be far more savvy and this great big chasm won't be as wide because they'll be savvy themselves? Do you think it's because we've got a whole generation who didn't have all this when they were at school and now their kids are? Do you think that'll stop?
It's really hard to predict the future, isn't it? But I think technology will always be moving forward. So I think one thing that we have to acknowledge is that the young people of today are digital natives, and I think that we, as an older generation, can't fully understand that because we've never been digital natives. For us, it's kind of there's an online world and there's an offline world. So for a while, we were talking about that in our sessions. We were talking about being safe online, being safe offline, but actually for children and young people, that is one and the same. So their lives exist so in parallel with online and offline worlds that we can't talk about them separately. So actually, and I think we'll come on to this a bit later, talking about behaviours within relationships, how to stay safe, and all of those kind of things underpin both online and offline. I think in terms of parents, we have a similar issue in terms of engaging parents, and it can be for a variety of different reasons. But I do also think that, coming back to the original question that you put, Susan, I think it has to be a whole community approach. We can't just rely on parents to be tackling this issue. And I'm speaking as a parent who is relatively well informed. I work in this space, but I still feel very fearful about my children growing up in this online hybrid world. So I think it has to be around everyone that comes into contact with that child and young person, which fundamentally is schools as well. So I think it's a joint approach, really. It has to be about the whole community.
And I think that young people are often very afraid, especially when we're talking about something to do with sexual violence, which is the topic of today, to report either to the school or to parents. And that's because of the fear of getting in trouble. And some of these new mobile phone banning policies, I believe they're actually going to create a bigger chasm between the young people and adults, because when there's a banning mentality or abstinence doesn't work, we know that with drugs and alcohol, and what we need is more digital literacy, not less. And my fear is that with this huge trend toward smartphone-free childhoods and mobile phone banning, we're just going to have a bigger chasm of lack of understanding between the adults and the young people. And why the young people don't want to report is because the law and the legal technicalities around, for instance, we've been talking about tech-facilitated sexual violence, intimate image abuse, under 18s, or any image is illegal. And so we also find young people are not learning the laws around the new intimate image abuses, the cyber flashing, the upskirting. They're not learning about them because it's just like, oh, this is child sexual exploitation or child porn. They're getting assemblies in schools from those police officers and so on that maybe are not informed enough about the nuances of the new laws. I was working with police officers just a couple weeks ago, and they were using Pocket Sergeant, and they'd never heard of some of the new offenses, and they don't understand the gradation of how to even apply these to the young people's experiences. So young people are very concerned they've done something illegal. They don't want to report. Creates a culture of fear. Very difficult to safeguard in that environment.
Goodness me. Assemblymember Cooper, thank you.
Thank you. The issue of parents, because that was the thing that I noticed was missing from our precursor questions. And I think this has always been a gap with parents being unwilling to, quite a lot of parents being unwilling to face the fact that their children are probably learning about things that they don't want them to learn about at a younger age than they think is even possible or likely. Because I can certainly remember when I was at school, and some people withdrew their children from sex lessons, which obviously we had with our RE teacher, and described as, what's your next lesson? I'm having sex with Mr. Darby, because we thought that was hilarious. But it's now moved on from there, so that people are not just accessing TikTok and Instagram. They're all, OnlyFans pops up in my phone, and it's not something I'm, interested in. Is there some way that have you got any recommendations about how to break down that gap that I think Assemblymember Hall has just pointed the finger at, that I'm saying I think has always been there between, what an older generation and children are looking at, or children are learning about? Is there something that we can do? Because I think you've just described the way that it's become so rife now, and what people can see, and and it does affect you, I believe. If you look at a lot of these things online, it affects you in the real world as well, because people think it's normal or ordinary, acceptable, or whatever word you want to put on it. Is there some way that we can engage better with parents?
So, yeah, I mean, I completely agree in that sense of there has to be a solution to bring them closer together. And I also want to echo the points Kate that, you know, it has to be a whole approach, because just having the parents, it's not going to make a difference if the staff haven't had the training, and the staff having the training and the parents not having training, it's not going to, you know, make a difference. So it has to be, you know, all encompassing. Something that we talk to parents about that has been quite popular and actually quite successful is in our parent sharing, we essentially give them prompts and TV shows or things that they can watch with their kids to aid discussion. So instead of, like Jessica said, you know, banning, which doesn't work, we encourage parents to lean in and to be inquisitive about what their kids are engaging with online. So, you know, sitting down, watching TikTok videos with them if they're on TikTok, or talking to them about, you know, what they're seeing on YouTube Shorts. Or one example that I love, and much to the outrage of lots of parents across the UK, is that we tell parents, you know, sit and watch Love Island with your kids. Sit and watch reality dating shows with them. Because if you think that they're not watching it, that's not true, because it gets clipped up and put on social media anyway. But I once had a parent come up to me, a father, and he said, well, I let my kids watch Love Island, but I watch it with them, and then in the car ride to school in the morning, we talk about the dynamics of each relationship. And I think that's just such a clever and meaningful way to not tell off your kids or lecture your kids, but to try see where they're at, to meet that, to be able to be critical and use that as a teaching moment. Obviously, it's not applicable in every single situation, but we've been finding that, you know, parents have come back to us and said, actually, I was able to have a really difficult discussion about gaslighting with my daughter or my son. And, you know, by getting on their level and understanding and, you know, making an effort to see what they're engaging in, it's broken down those barriers because, again, you know, we've spoken about the fact that this is kids' world. You know, so many more kids are going online to find companionship, to find friendship. And it's not, we can't see it as weird because it's the new normal. It is how it is for them. So we just have to help them to be the healthiest versions, not limit their access.
Be inquisitive, be engaged, even around online areas that you yourself wouldn't naturally want to, and certainly Love Island, God, you made me feel quite ill now. That's certainly not something I want to watch, but okay, I think that's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Remember Lord Bailey.
Thank you. I just have to take exception one thing. I do think banning works because it's not a total ban, it's a moment, isn't it? I've been a youth worker for over 30 years, and sometimes to ask children to put down what is 100% their world for 20 minutes so you can focus on something else is very, very useful. This theme of parents, I think, is very important because many of us around the table are engaged in different things which involve children, and parents are the last people to get mentioned. If youth work teaches you anything, 10 minutes with your parents is worth 100 hours with somebody who's a supposed professional, because children still have an innate need to feel that their parents can, in quotes, defend them or educate them or something like that. I really appreciate the thing about Love Island because the power of a parent is conversation. That's pretty much all you can have, particularly as they get older, because they are forming their own views. But rant over. To what extent do you think peer-to-peer sexual harassment and assault is an issue in London schools? I'm picking up, you may feel this issue, so if I start at that end and we'll scoot along, we'll start. Ellie.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think when we talk about peer-on-peer sexual harassment, the first thing I want to note is, again, from our testimonies. And one, you know, we go through and we process these testimonies. So our team reads these accounts, we anonymise them, and then we post them onto our website. And something that always gets feeded back to us is the most common phrase is, this is the first time I'm telling somebody. So a lot of the time, our website, it's the first time that somebody is feeling that they can share. And I think what we question is, how is this the first place that they're telling somebody? How have we got to the point where they're not telling their parents, they're not telling their teacher, they're not telling their friends even? And a lot of the time, our website will be the only place that they go to tell somebody, and they will carry that for the rest of their life. And as we know, a lot of it happens and starts in schools. So I think one of the first things is the importance of teacher training. Now, this isn't just for safeguarding leads, because a lot of the time it will only be safeguarding leads at the school that get the training. But all staff need to be trained on how to take disclosures, how to handle peer-on-peer sexual harassment in the classroom. It's compulsory with our education programme. You have to have staff training at some point for us to come to the school. And, you know, a lot of the time, I think, where we're seeing peer-on-peer sexual harassment, it's happening in geography classes, in maths lessons. And teachers are trained in de-escalation. So their go-to move is, let's bring the tone down of this conversation, let's move on, let's not let this escalate. And although they have the best of intentions, unfortunately, a lot of the time, that negatively affects the victim or survivor in that situation and actually contributes to a culture of silence, and where those young people feel like, well, it's not getting picked up on in class. And I've communicated to a teacher that this makes me feel uncomfortable, but they just dismissed it. And that's where we see those cycles beginning. So, you know, more kind of understanding of active listening skills for teachers, how to genuinely talk to kids, how to offer solutions, not just focusing on kind of de-escalation, and being able to have really difficult conversations, because the conversations that are happening in classrooms at the moment are becoming increasingly more difficult to navigate for a lot of teachers. So, yeah, Jessica, I'll pass on to you.
Yeah, I did some sexual violence and bystanding workshops piloted with 1,200 young people, and it's actually across England, but also in Ireland and Canada. And one of the things that we were quite shocked about is that 55% of the young people had never learned about sexual violence at all in school, so it wasn't really touched upon as part of their RSE. And they really benefited just from learning about the basic terminologies, including the tech facilitated, because as we've already heard, they're digital natives, and the online and the offline are so closely intertwined. And we have now worked upon those workshops to create teacher training, and there's 4 modules that we've developed with a charity called Life Lessons. And it's free teacher training that we were able to design through government-supported research funding. And we have modules on understanding sexual violence, educating about sexual violence, tech-facilitated gender-based sexual violence, and dealing with disclosures and instances of sexual violence. And we just really need more. We've heard a lot about resources, but we do need more resources for teachers, all teachers, to be upskilled about this, so that the tactics that they typically use, which Ellie has talked about, aren't necessarily the ones that shut down the victims, that they're actually able to have a range of support strategies. They're actually feel more comfortable and upskilled to deal with it, because they have the best of intentions, but they may just not really have the skill set to know how to handle the types of situations that are being brought into the school, and particularly when we're talking about that online and real life interface. So I'm sure you have more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to echo, really. I think particularly what Ellie was saying around ensuring that all teachers, all school staff are trained, I think that's so key. One word that I'm going to bring up is the word banter, and I think that one can be quite challenging, because often we will hear teachers who say, oh, that's just banter, or oh, that's just them messing around. And I think there needs to be a huge amount of awareness raising done on what constitutes sexual harassment versus banter. Yeah. And that's both within the teaching staff, but also them being able to have those conversations, as we were just saying. So in a school setting where sexual harassment has occurred, or misogynistic attitudes are very pervasive in that school, teachers being able to unpick that and really look at what conversations are happening, how language is interpreted, what the impacts are. So all of those kind of things, I think, are everyone in that school's issue, really. And I think, often it falls onto safeguarding leads to be the ones that are educated on that, and it absolutely has to be the whole school community.
I'm going to put it over to the mayors and MOPAC's work around continuing to support young people who are impacted by violence. But just to go back to teachers, just to say a few things in their defence, I've been a governor of several schools. Of course, their primary role is to teach. Their responsibility is to teach. They will get complained about, is the polite word, if they don't teach. How do you weigh that up with a very important need to have these skills? And also, we talk about resources. The resource that the teacher lacks most is time. No amount of money can give you time. And so how does a teacher balance that up? How do you reflect it in your training? Is there somewhere else in the school's existence that can happen as well? I go back to my colleague Leonie Cooper's comments around parents, because that's why I think parents are an important part, because they will have more time. But I'm very interested in that, because we would ask the Mayor, he has said he wants to do more around violence, around VAUG. We would ask the Mayor to invest that money. Yeah, where would you have that money placed in view of my comments around the workload of teachers?
Can I just say one thing? I would say high quality and statutory RSE, and that time is given to teachers in their timetable and resources in the school, because it's often the most poorly resourced subject area. And then groups like Everyone's Invited are left holding the bag, coming in as the third sector to fill the gaps for the school. It has to be a sort of institutionalized whole environment sort of situation, and that's where the Mayor of London is amazing and leads on these types of issues, and more power to him to be empowering the teachers of London in ways that some other areas might not be. So I would suggest that he really gets behind high quality RSE and the teacher training again. Sorry to jump in.
No. You would see that as a place you could, I'm talking about money here.
Yeah.
You could spend the money in that area.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would fully agree. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that intersect here. I think in terms of RSE, teachers need support to deliver that effectively, and it's so often been an add-on, so it's delivered by someone who doesn't necessarily have training in all the areas that RSE encompasses. It's not just about sex, it's not about biology. It's about that, but it's also about healthy relationships, all the things that we've spoken about today, and I think there does need to be investment in training to ensure that that's being delivered effectively. I think there are specialist organisations that exist in terms of teachers' time. There's 2 of those organisations here today. So we exist purely to support schools in this area. So I think there does have to be funding for prevention, education, for support for teachers from those organisations that exist to do that. And coming back to your point around teaching being their primary focus, fundamentally, being healthy and understanding your rights and responsibilities and feeling safe in your school environment underpins their ability to pay attention in class, to feel like they can give their full selves to whatever lesson it is that they're in. So I think that absolutely teaching is key in terms of subject matter, but also we have to be seeing the importance of teaching skills that underpin everything that children and young people are learning. We can't learn about maths if we're not feeling safe, if we're not feeling like we're going to be listened to about something that we're worried about. So I think it just has to be prioritised in that way.
Firstly, to finish, I like your insertion of the word responsibilities. We talk a lot to children about their rights. I think things will improve. We talk about responsibility. I would say, Chair, gives us the definite where the Mayor could be spending some money. I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I agree with that. Assemblymember Vernon.
Before I ask you my question, so I was a girl that went to school in London a long time ago, but I have been thinking recently, at what point, and through this conversation, we started off with the phrase unwanted touching. At what point does that become sexual assault for a girl in school or in college? And from your experience, we've heard about how we can support teachers, but if what is happening, if we strip away all of the other stuff, is kind of low level, but it's sexual assault of girls and it is normalised, and so we talk about it in forums like this, at what point do we actually kind of either address that with... It feels like a lot for a teacher to deal with something which is criminal, I guess is what I'm saying, and I don't know how this conversation translates into boys and girls and teachers and everybody else understanding that actually what might start as banter will progress or can progress into basically people are verbally or sexually or physically assaulting each other and they don't realise it. I would really appreciate your reflections on that.
Yeah, so what you're describing is rape culture. It's the fact that, in the UK, we live in a rape culture. And when I say that, I mean a culture that normalises and trivialises sexual violence and rape. And as I said earlier, it exists in society, but it really does take root in schools. And that's where those kind of like formative experiences begin. And you know, one thing that we really try and do is, again, I'm going to say preventative earlier, because we won't have so much of that issue if we're educating at a younger age, because, you know, young people will be coming through understanding how to communicate with one another, understanding those boundaries, physical boundaries, at a younger age, being able to take that into their relationships later on. So preventative is kind of the cure to that, we believe. But I think also...
Can I just interrupt you?
Sure.
It's when that thing happens.
I guess I'm asking, is part of this training and the support that teachers are advised to call the police, to inform parents? What happens in an ecosystem to just kill that behaviour?
So every single school will have, you know, a kind of a different safeguarding team and a different approach. They will have their own kind of rules and regulations over when somebody is contacted. What I will say about safeguarding in particular, and when the intervention happens, is that for a lot of young people, safeguarding is not fit for purpose in the way that it exists now. So loads of survivors and victims and young people that we speak to say that the actual process of reporting and going to a safeguarding leader at school is more traumatising than the actual assault that happened to them. And if that is the response of survivors and victims, something is going fundamentally wrong. So I think that there's, you know, I'll shout out Brit School in Croydon are doing an incredible job with their safeguarding to really prioritise what the student wants to happen, instead of constantly going straight to police or constantly going to call the parents, because actually that can be more destructive and cause more harm than actually sitting down with that student and saying, what do you want? Like, how does this play out where you feel safe and heard? Because, you know, when a young person comes forward, the amount of power and control that they're letting go by sharing that story is astronomical. And, you know, I think safeguarding works really well when it's a collaboration where applicable. And I think it's a really difficult topic. I don't know what you see in schools or what you find, but I think that there needs to be a lot more agency on schools being able to take a more collaborative approach to safeguarding.
Yeah, I mean, I just did some research with Surrey Police and the relationship between the police and the school in dealing with sexual violence. And, like, there seemed to be sort of a tension where the schools felt like the police felt like the schools were turning to the police too soon and too much. And the schools felt sort of disempowered from being able to do anything because of the statutory requirements around reporting and the chain, the evidence trail and everything. And I would just fully agree with what Ellie's saying, that a supportive environment for the victims, but also more perpetrator, whatever, if we use that terminology in square quotes, support through the whole situation. I mean, restorative justice or other forms of engagement that don't immediately, you know, criminalize or discipline or bring in these punitive measures is often what the victims, but also the perpetrators, I'm just using that that language, need in order to actually address these things. And I just wanted to thank you, Sam, because the issue of colleges in terms of sex education investment, I think that that's sort of a gray area where we don't have, and I know you're talking about very early prevention, but also that's where a lot of incidents are happening. We also need some actual sex education reminder work there, because we even do it in universities, right? We have like sexual misconduct and sexual assault training and so on, and colleges are so deregulated, they're missing out on an important opportunity at a very crucial age as well. So I just wanted to, because you mentioned schools and colleges, I just wanted to say how important that was as well.
I would just echo completely what's been said, actually. I don't think I've got anything further to add on that.
Okay, so to my actual question, sorry, Janet.
I wanted to ask you if there is a link between violence against women and girls and gang association, and how schools are addressing this. Just, I think from my perspective, my constituency, Hackney, Islington and Waltham Forest, we have 3 great boroughs, but we do suffer from gang-related violence and issues and territorialism and all the rest of it. But again, it's very focused on the victims and the perpetrators being boys and young men, and I just wonder how women and girls can be, how that can be addressed in a school context.
Do you want to start?
No,
okay.
you go first.
So criminal sexual exploitation is massive for kind of girls and their involvement with, as you were saying, with gangs and kind of being brought into violence. And I think, you know, as a group, women are, as we know, very marginalised and vulnerable and susceptible to getting pulled into violence. And we haven't directly worked necessarily in kind of that intersection and haven't seen that as much. I think we tend to see that with people that are like rooted in the councils, so like safeguarding officers that are local authority based, that will understand, because, you know, a lot of the time I would say for us, Kate, is that we are not always there. So we go in once or twice a year, and we would love to go in more. But yeah, you know, that is something that I would say is probably more related to the school or the local authority. I wouldn't know necessarily how to answer that.
I mean, that being said, the gender dynamics and the issues involved could also be dealt with in RSE, right? In terms of like learning about gender, inequalities and these intersections that were already brought up by Lord Bailey around class and race and that word of intersectionality. Those kinds of ideas can be really well situated in a curriculum, a strong RSE curriculum that helps us understand power and imbalance. And like, I think we're going to come on later to misogyny influencers like Andrew Tate, so maybe I'll bracket it, but the reason why boys are attracted to those influencers is because of economic vulnerabilities. Yeah. He's selling them. It's like a pyramid scheme online. Like, join my channel, and you know, I'll upskill you, and then you can become like really. You'll have a like
forex trading and
Bugatti or whatever car he has or whatever. Like, so these kinds of things are intersectional power inequalities about masculinities and femininities, and all of these can be incorporated into a high quality RSE curriculum.
I would completely agree. I was about to say exactly the same. I think for Tender, again, our expertise isn't in gang-related violence, but I agree. I think it does come down to the fundamentals of looking at behaviours, looking at misogyny, looking at kind of the societal imbalances that kind of hold up these things and make them appealing. So I think it does feed into the work that we're doing. It's not a particular area of expertise of ours, but I do think that it's all about core training, core understanding from RSE, from specialist organisations in terms of unpicking the issues that kind of the foundations of this.
Just back really quickly. So it sounds like your specialisms are not in this particular area, but similar to the questions from Lord Bailey about kind of grooming and so on, it seems self-evident that in London, where this is a particular issue, it's not just in London, but it's very kind of concentrated here, and in particular parts of London, including my constituency, but also others, there seems to be a bit of a blind spot, therefore, about not addressing how girls and young women may or may not be groomed into particular behaviours. I mean, also boys as well, but that doesn't seem to feature in kind of the conversations that would be had at school or between kind of students and their educators. That seems to be a gap. And if there are services like yours that are not addressing that, I just wonder how we might fill that gap.
Well, I think what Jessica was saying is we do in the kind of the fundamentals of the education around, around sexual violence, around manipulation, around coercive control. That is where that education starts, and that's how we can do that. But that more specialist niche sometimes needs to be, supplemented. It's a whole approach. So we can't go in and fix all of it. It's about teachers working with us, parents working with us, local authorities. When we go to schools, we say, have we worked with the local authority that we're going to? Have we worked with the school's police officers? Have we looked at how we can take a whole holistic approach? So I do think that we counter those issues of how young women can be manipulated and coerced into those situations, but it's not always, targeted and specific. I don't know if you...
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Thank you. Somebody remember best.
Thank you. Just wanted to come quickly to the work of Everyone's Invited, and obviously and this isn't meant as a criticism, it's just a kind of question genuinely, is how do you make sure, obviously there's lots of submissions easily accessible on your website, how do you make sure that's not material that people that are encouraged by that behaviour or perpetrators can enjoy reading or get a kick out of looking at or seeing as other people are doing this? Maybe it's good for me to do. A similar example is the police stopped sharing knives, for example, when they took them off the street because it showed the knives and made people, encourage people to carry knives. So I'm not necessarily saying that's what happened, but if you understand the question.
It's something that we've spoken about, and it's definitely at the very beginning was, you know, is a consideration. But for us, what that platform has provided outweighs the kind of that potential risk. And you know, there are so many places in which potential perpetrators or perpetrators can go online and find that material, and you know, perpetrators are going to find a way to perpetrate, whether we share those stories online or we don't. And for us, the kind of cathartic and impactful presence of having, you know, we have 7-year-old, 8-year-old children come to us and say, I put my testimony on your website, you're the first person I told. That, for us, is the priority. And it's definitely a safeguarding consideration, and it's definitely a risk that we are ongoingly talking about, and how can we think about how people access it and how they're using it. But for us, the priority is to continue upholding that space for survivors and victims to share their stories anonymously.
And my other question is, well, you said earlier you've got 10,000 submissions kind of waiting to be processed. And how do you deal with perhaps being a victim of your platform's own success, of if you've got 10,000 submissions and people see you as a trustworthy source to take a story to, if something, you know, is happening and perhaps somebody could do with some intervention and now it's in a backlog, you're the first person they've told the story to and it's in a backlog of 10,000. Is there any way in which you have thought about or that do prioritise to make sure, you know, if we're the first people getting this information and we can intervene now?
So our purpose as an organisation is not to intervene. So what we're there to do is to facilitate a space. We can't see any information essentially about what's sent in to us. So, you know, we can't connect it to a name or a person or a place. It's completely separate. So our goal is not to intervene per se. Our goal is to facilitate a space for them to share that story. We have an incredible team of volunteers who spend their time processing testimonies, who spend hours reading through child sexual abuse, and who are, you know, doing their best to get those numbers through. And yeah, that hasn't been something that survivors or victims have really come to us and complained about. I think a lot of the time there is a lot of benefit in seeing your story, but sometimes it's just writing it and knowing it's gone somewhere. So yeah, we don't, our purpose is not to intervene anyway, so we wouldn't be able to prioritise per se.
Thank you. And just Ellie, coming to you again, how concerned are you with the use of AI with the new kind of deep fake imagery and the impact it's having young women and girls, not only for pupils but also teachers? I mean, we've got a local school where the teachers were all victims of this recently.
It's terrifying. And yeah, I mean, tech-enabled abuse, especially with violence against women and girls, is something that I'm really glad is getting more attention and people are really starting to speak about. But I think if we want to talk about AI and image-based abuse, I think we really, you know, if we want to understand the impact, we really need to begin with talking about the sharing of intimate images and image-based abuse, because I think, you know, this is something that Jessica touched on earlier. The way that we teach kids about these topics a lot of the time, it's easy just to jump straight to the law and to kind of, you know, every kid that we've worked with knows that it's illegal to send an image under the age of 18. But what that does is it leaves a space for victims and survivors not to be able to access support when things go wrong, because there's a massive barrier in place of this is illegal, so I can't tell anybody. We worked with a student last month who was, I think, 14, 15 years old, and we spoke to her about the ability to get help. And she said, well, I didn't think I could tell anybody because I thought I was going to prison. Mm-hmm. You know, so if we're going to speak about more advanced forms of tech-enabled abuse, we really have to scale it back first and get comfortable talking to young people about how they can genuinely access support. So yes, we give them the law and the definition, but at the same time we're telling them, you know what, if you do send this image, you're not going to prison. This is how you can access help. This is how you can access support. These are the things that are out there. And again, this may be an uncomfortable feeling and thought, but it's not necessarily, you know, wild or a bad thing that young people want to share those images. You know, we have to understand that that is a lot of the ways in which young people do communicate these days because of, you know, we're talking about kids that have come out of COVID as well, who, you know, the only way that they could necessarily connect sometimes sexually or explore their sexuality was through being online. So it's about not necessarily just criminalising it, but at the same time as giving those legal definitions, it's giving people the access to know that they can get that support and they can talk to people about it. And again, up-to-date training and resources is so important, and you know, it's not worth delivering it if we're giving them something in 5 years' time that's already done. So something that we do is, you know, our materials are updated every 6 months in line with what we're seeing in schools. So the reason that we're being successful with teachers is because we are being proactive in our approach instead of just reactive. So we're not getting there a year or two later than it's happened. We're right on the cusp of when they're seeing it. So I think, yeah, in conclusion, we need to talk more about, you know, the kind of the safety and how focus the education more on here's all the access, not don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And also, you know, be able to give the time and give the resources to teachers that are up to date and in a timely fashion.
Yeah, I have to agree because a lot of these are platform specific. So, and they're also I was just at a Safer Internet Day, and they were talking about an app called Reviva, which is like, oh, look, you can like kiss your crush. So you put somebody you like's head on to the figure, and then you can experiment what it would be like to kiss, and then it's like kiss your crush or more. And these are like really worrisome sort of trends about how AI, and it was being promoted on Instagram. So it was like a different app, but it was being promoted on a social media platform, and then you can see the videos on TikTok. And so this is all interacting kind of like ecosphere, right? But the issue is still goes back to this high quality RSE where they actually learn about consent, because digital literacy and using AI also has to revolve around the consent. Do you have consent to do that? Have you thought about, you know, this interaction and the relationship happening when you put someone's face on something or you do something non-consensual to them? So I think we get really caught up with these like, oh my God, there's these new AI harms, and, you know, obviously we need to take them seriously. These new child sexual abuse material laws in the Online Safety Act, they're not going to deal with this interrelational issue. They're more designed to deal with the dark web and pedophiles and pedophile like manuals or whatever that is being designed out there. We need to be dealing with consent issues on the ground early, all the way through the whole gamut of education, and through high quality RSE that also, you know, where digital and sexuality come together, because they're totally intermerged in the digital natives' lives.
Yeah. I've been nodding profusely because I fully agree on that. I think just anecdotally, there was a teacher that was saying to us the other day that a lot of their students don't think that deep fakes are bad because they're not real. And that, I think, points to what we were just saying about it's about the kind of concepts that underpin all of this. So yes, we need to be talking about consent, because whether it's real or not actually isn't the question. It's about empathy. How does this make someone feel? What are the impacts of this? Consent, exactly. So what are the ways that you can kind of empower yourself to understand this better? So it's not necessarily about the technology itself. Yes, we need to understand that, but I do think that, again, it comes back to quality RSE and having these conversations where we can just unpick some of these preconceptions or these misconceptions about whatever topic it is that we're talking about, and talk about the feelings behind it, and practicing those skills, practicing those behaviours that actually underpin all of this, I think is really key.
Would say, and I think, and it has been said, RSE is great. I think RSE is really important and being a big supporter of that, especially the expanded curriculum. But all of it is worth nothing without parenting. All of it is worth nothing without conversations about consent at home. And all of it's worth nothing if a kid goes home and a parent says something like, well, deepfakes aren't real. So I know, and that's not to put down any of the work done. It's just, like you said, the most depressing thing to hear today is obviously the abuse facing children, but the fact that so little parents are willing to engage in your workshops. That is one of the most depressing things to hear, because nothing can really overcome that without parents being engaged in this.
Or could promote some kinds of engagements with parents, like even like leaflets that like, here's how Snapchat works, you know, so that parents aren't so afraid. Snapchat is a terrible offender. If you could ban any of the apps, ban Snapchat, you know.
Said not banning, and but Snapchat is something that my children will never, ever, ever have, and they've been told so.
I think if you take a banning approach, it should be platform specific, because it's completely wrong to kind of equalize them all. And I have seen so many harms. I've been studying Snapchat in depth for 6 years, and the risks outweigh the benefits. And I'm surprised to say that as a sociologist who takes youth rights and stuff very seriously. But I just think, show the parents how these apps work. It doesn't take like loads to actually upskill them and empower them.
Yeah, and I'd also say on this, like, the rate at which young people are digitally literate and have had to protect themselves from these things is incredible. You know, like, I'll speak to 13, 14-year-olds, and it's so depressing because all of them know, oh yeah, well, you don't add that person on Snapchat because they take your nudes and they send them around, or that's a scammer, or they know far more than we know. They have had to upskill and protect themselves because we're too late to the party. And actually using young people as much as you possibly can when it comes to, you know, digital spaces. They know far more than we do. And they've actually had to create a world in which they have to protect themselves from this. So, yeah, like upskilling parents on actually, you know, having those conversations with their kids, and they know what to do.
Can I just make one point perhaps for you, is that the Cyber Helpline has lost £180,000 of VRU funding this year, and I don't know if that's being reallocated to another online cyber unit. If we can pick that up as part of this as well.
I mean, you're impressed by it, and I think perhaps we all are. Coming to my next question, the thing I was depressed about was that apparently 32% of young boys or young men have got a positive view on Andrew Tate, which, I mean, that is depressing because, I mean, he is a misogynist. So, I mean, my question is, how are teachers tackling the influence of harmful online misogynistic influencers, particularly among boys? I mean, how are teachers coping with that, or is that part of the learning skill? I'll start with Ellie.
So, yeah, this is actually my area of specialism. So 3 years ago, I developed our online misogyny training in response to what we were seeing in classrooms before teachers kind of knew about Tate. And honestly, I always advise teachers, don't even go there because he's so old school. They'll be like, oh, that was so 2022. You know, you don't know what's going on anymore. And, you know, what I think is more terrifying is the kind of micro influences that he has spawned. He is like, the way I see him is like a gateway from this very scary online far-right space to essentially hundreds of these micro-influencers selling this idea of like what it is to be a man and how to be a man. And so we've trained the Greater Manchester Police, we've trained the VRU, we've trained parents and local authorities up and down the UK in actually the precise methods that these influencers use, because they're very, very careful and they're very specific, they're very subtle. And one of the things that we do that I think is really helpful is shattering the illusion. So talking to kids about how these videos and these images and these influences are created, because it's completely manufactured. So we talk to them about, we get them to spot all the different things that they've put in. So the fast-paced editing, the, even really subtle things like a lot of podcast influencers who are men who are speaking about misogyny, they'll turn to the side and they'll speak off camera. Now, the reason they do that is because it makes it look like they're speaking to somebody else, and that legitimizes that sentiment, right? Because it looks like a conversation, not somebody just staring straight at the screen. But what we say to them is, that guy's probably going to stand up and go have dinner with his mum downstairs, you know? But yet what he's showing is this video of him with cars, and this is what you should do to your woman if she talks to you like this. I have 12-year-old boys talking about what their wife will be allowed to do when they're older. and, you know, talking about, well, yeah, you know, my girlfriend can have a 6-figure job, but I have to have a 7-figure. I'm in control. Talking about, you know, they're parroting things that have been said by men that are on the other side of the globe, that are just factually incorrect, that have no data, you know, backing. So what we say is shatter the illusion, right? So break down who they are and what the reality probably is. But also, the most important thing, and I think it will be our priority this year, is teaching kids critical analysis. And that's so important when it comes to fake news and what they're seeing online. So in Helsinki, they teach critical analysis from 7 years old up. So why am I seeing this? What is this telling me? Why do I feel a certain way about it? And I think that that's a really key way. You know, going into schools and saying these people are bad, that's just going to make the kids like them more, because the element that they have that's so enticing is they're like big kids. So they're like older siblings to them. They look like they're having fun and they've got this lifestyle, so it's something to really look up to. But, you know, shattering that illusion and talking to them about different options, what different men look like, what they do, and they won't hear from those men, the normal men, because they're too busy doing their jobs, looking after their families. So to wrap that up, sorry, rant over, I would say that, yeah, critical analysis is really key. Talking, you know, having proper methods for teachers to be able to hold really kind of good conversations that tease out the argument and the sentiment underneath it. And most importantly, talking to kids about gender inequality at a young age. Talking to young boys in particular that feminism and equality is not against them, it is for them. And actually the patriarchy and, you know, male dominance that's being sold to them is a negative for them. It doesn't work for them.
Can I just say that I think you're absolutely right. It's part of a wider trend around disinformation and polarization that we see online. And we've got the new regime in America, and loads of like disinformation is circulating. And these types of gendered disinformation need to be taken very seriously. They're part of digital literacy, this critical literacy around what kids are seeing online, what's an actual statistic, what's a fact. Children are very confused now about believing statistics. They might not believe the government statistics because there's so much misinformation and disinformation circulating, of which this is a prime example, that then has this behavioral effect. So I would just want to point out that the White Ribbon has done a really interesting campaign called Max Hate, and it's a really, really interesting thing about a young boy watching all of these videos and then sort of like becoming this figure themselves. And also that White Ribbon campaign found out that 49% of parents were unaware of the hateful and sexist stuff that was targeting their boys. So this again comes back to the parents and sort of like trying to provide them with the information that they need to be like finding out what their children are being exposed to, and these kinds of disinformation and misinformation which are so rife.
Just very briefly, I'll come in just to build on your point about feminism not being against them. Anecdotally, there was a teacher that was saying the other day that, yes, there is a big problem with these influencers online that we hear about, but actually there's also a huge problem. There was a kind of statistic that was put out last year around Gen Z young men believing that feminism has gone too far. And actually what we're seeing in the classroom, a teacher was telling me the other day, is, yes, the influencers that we hear about, but also it's boys and young men who fundamentally believe in gender equality, but think that feminism, or think that pushing for gender equality is what's causing all of the problems at the moment. So actually gender equality is what we have now, and we need to just be quiet and sit with it, otherwise all the problems will happen from there. So I think there's deeper rooted issues as well around misogynistic culture and kind of how our culture is set up that we need to be unpicking in schools that feed these influencers like Andrew Tate, where they're looking for solutions, they're looking for, oh, how can we make this better? That's why they turn to them, because actually they're seeing what they're seeing in their day-to-day lives is that they don't feel comfortable and happy with.
So very briefly, because we're running out of time, we also have cultures within our country that don't treat women on an equal level, and we do notice that. So do you think that compounded? I mean, I worry about women in general at their safety. If we've got misogynists like Andrew Tate, if we've got cultures that don't believe that women are absolutely equal, do you think that's all rushing into far more? I mean, we heard from you earlier and from our previous panel how VOG is getting worse and worse. Do you think that that's all playing into the same thing?
I'll just quickly say I think there is a backlash against feminism at the moment, which is fed by these types of regressive masculinity politics that are playing out globally, but we also see a rise in the far right. Sorry, I'm bringing it to big sociology now. So I think that we necessarily, I think it's dangerous to say some cultures. I think British culture is very patriarchal and sexist writ large, and I'm Canadian, I'm not American, by the way. But I just think that we are in a very regressive backlash type of environment right now. We always saw this big success and everyone's invited, and Me Too, and all of these things, and we're seeing a backlash. And maybe Ali has something to contribute.
Yeah, I would say it's more linked to kind of the far right. I would say that's what we're seeing in schools, is that kind of that move into, I'm going to disassociate from society because society is not working for me. And yeah, kind of feeding into that male loneliness epidemic that people are talking about so much online, of boys and men kind of feeling like I feel isolated from society and angry and I've got mental health issues, and that not being a symptom of the patriarchy but being feminism's problem or equality's problem. So I'd say what we're seeing the most is kind of that lean into a more fringe kind of far right culture.
I could go into that for hours, but we absolutely don't have the time. I've got a couple of people, Assemblymember Lord Baby, very briefly.
This conversation we have to return to. I'm going to have to disagree with the far right thing, because you can imagine how people from my community are not running to join the far right. But we have as much of this, if not more, than others. Most of the young men I speak to, and it's a group, probably 200 to 300 of them in different associations, they're slightly older. They'll be maybe 16 into their 30s. They will talk about a cosy consensus that we all have, because we're professionals and we all agree on stuff, and we don't see where they're coming from. Their main thing is they resent being told that they're wicked just because they're male, and they think that we believe that. And I wonder how we deal with that, because it's quite hard to. They have a lot of evidence that they believe that's true. But my real point is that the question I want to ask is, how do we prevent young people from worrying? Because much of what we hear now is just me. I think I'm digitally on it. I really did. You have really made me worry. I have a 15-year-old son who I'm going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with just because of a few things you've said. You, Professor, have challenged my deep sort of, I did sociology, I thought I knew it all. I'm going to have a big reset. And Kate, I'm not even going to talk about what Kate's done to my worldview. But how do we not, because worried young men are much easier to persuade to do the wrong thing. I've seen it all through my youth work. How do we have these conversations and say to them, you're not evil because you're a boy, because there's a great belief around that. The Andrew Tate thing, I don't think we should name him, but he's just not that important. And then somehow we've made him important. Telling people they're far right, that any progress this conversation has is closed off the minute you use the words far right, because my community has no association with them and never will. So how do we have a conversation that says there are aspects to being a man that you might believe that could be problematic, but you don't need to worry about them because we can fix them if you look at these things? How do we have that? Because I hear a lot of conversation, but I don't hear that, which I think would cut through.
Yeah, sure. I just want to do a shout out to a charity group called Beyond Equality that specialize in working on masculinity issues and positive masculinity, and they do it from a cross-cultural perspective. And I've done some work with them, exploring how they work with young men and boys, and try to kind of like unpick a lot of these norms. Think about insecurities, vulnerabilities, defensiveness. So I think that it's specialized groups can help. But again, I'd like to come back to the overall meta-narrative I think that we're promoting here, which is that better education around these gender inequalities that's intersectional, that deals with cultural specificity, and that deals with all of these like nuances is really, really needed.
And it's needed early. I think that's the key, is we need to be talking to children and young people about this from primary school, and it can be age appropriate. It doesn't have to be, scare tactics. It doesn't have to be anything that's above their age range in terms of what they can comprehend, but we have to be having the conversations around positive behaviours in order to empower children and young people, empower young men and boys from the very beginning of their education to go, oh, actually, I can be this, I want to be this, I deserve this, these are my rights. So if we're having those conversations early, and you said, how do we make them not fearful? We bring them into that conversation, because children and young people are inquisitive. I've got a 3-year-old who's asking me big questions already that I'm trying my best to answer, because if you shut them down, they go and find their information elsewhere, right? So I think if we're having the conversations effectively and early, that's how we can get rid of the fear.
Assemblymember Moama, can you ask a very quick question?
Yes. It relates back to a question that I put to you earlier about when does behaviour become criminal and at what point does that intervene, and we teach that lesson. And from a different perspective, agreeing with some of what Lord Bailey has said, if we're not in a position to teach, to support, in this case, boys and young men, that something that they're doing is bad, and at some point that unwanted behaviour becomes just criminal and wrong, how can we then address toxic masculinity, misogyny, whatever we want to call it? Because I think in a similar vein, I would say that for me, there are many feminisms, and not all of it speaks to me, I'll be honest with you. And I think a lot of people feel that way. So in terms of universalising this, how do we make sure that we're not having one service here for people, something here for people, and actually we are addressing, getting back to the point where we're dealing with teaching boys and young men how to behave in ways which don't promote violence towards girls and women as they get older?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that really quickly. So I think one thing I'll say is kind of on a universal approach. I think, as you said, there's lots of. It's really important to have specific organisations that do that specific work that can kind of fit all those different remits. But I think a lot of us are really linked by the kind of the core belief when it comes to talking to young men and boys about their behaviour. As we've said, talking about gender inequality at a really young age, one of the first things we say to boys that we work with is, we're going to talk about gender inequality and the way that it negatively affects you as much as it negatively affects me. So we recognise the struggles that they're facing and why it might kind of materialise in a lot of kind of defensiveness or anger. And we also talk about the fact that it doesn't have to be a scary conversation. No one's going to get cancelled in this room. That's not what we're here to do. It's okay to be accountable. One of the first things I always say to kids is, I used to do this. I used to slut shame my friends. I used to invalidate my male friends' experiences of sexual violence. We can have those experiences and be better and work better. For us, it's a lot of recognising those issues, being able to explain them, giving them solutions, talking to them about, being a man doesn't have to just be one thing. So giving them options and, encouraging schools as well. We talk a lot about role models, and it's really important to platform, role models like famous footballers and athletes and musicians and whatever, but actually I think more of a move to people that they see every day in their community and uplifting people that they see every day in their community that are quote-unquote normal people, right, that have jobs that they might want to go into one day that isn't being a tennis superstar. So I think having those role models, empowering men as well, and saying to the male teachers in schools, this conversation, we not only want you, but we need you, and we need you to be here more than the female teachers are showing up. So those are some ways that I would say counter that, and then using loads of different organisations, parents, working with Tender, and everyone's invited, and other organisations like Split Banana and Beyond Equality, all together, you fit all of those those niches, I think.
Thanks. There's one question left, and that's just to Kate, and if you could be brief, I'd be very grateful. What are the most important features of Tender's Schools Toolkit that help develop healthy views on relationships, and what impact is it having, and what are your next steps?
I'm so sorry, I missed the middle of that question.
I read it too quickly. It's completely my fault. What are the most important features of Tender's Schools Toolkit that help develop healthy views of relationships, and what impact is it having, and what are the next steps?
So I think that what's important about the toolkit is that it's accessible for every teacher in London, and every teacher needs to be able to access information. That's kind of underpinning all of the things that we've talked about today. So in that toolkit, we've got information about the issue, how to have those conversations, and we've got some example exercises that we have been delivering for years. So we've been delivering them for over 20 years. We know they work, to open out those conversations, because as I've said earlier, conversation, I think, is underpinning all of this, and having those conversations early. So that toolkit is really important in giving teachers something that they can draw on. We've had a training programme that's existed alongside that, so where we've been giving them information about kind of how to deliver this in the room, some tips, some tools. So I think it's really foundational in terms of enabling all teachers in London to have something that they can access. Going forward with the programme, we've looked at the feedback from this, so we've had really consistently positive feedback in terms of the impact it's had on teachers who have accessed the training. So 89% on average have said that it's positively impacted their ability to have or their confidence to have conversations with children and young people about relationships. Teachers from over 600 schools have attended the sessions, so in terms of breadth, that's brilliant that we're able to do that. Looking at the feedback that we've had from these sessions and from the access of the toolkit itself, we know that teachers want even more support in terms of mirroring, so how they can do it actively in the room, because actually it's a confidence issue, I think, often. They can have that information at their fingertips, but being able to have that conversation in the room can be really challenging. So they want to see professionals doing it, and our professionals have been doing this for 20 years. Like I say, a lot of our facilitators have been doing this for a very, very long time. They've had every single conversation that could possibly crop up in this area, which means that a teacher observing that, they get a bit more confidence in terms of how they can deliver it. So we're looking at more direct delivery in the room to really kind of model that behaviour. But like I say, I think it existing as a resource that all teachers can access is a really foundational, positive start to what is a complex issue.
So is the confidence to be able to have the conversations, and as we've discussed, conversations are so important. So we could have gone on for hours like this morning's session. You've all got so much information that we'd love to glean, and there's a couple of things I know I'd love to go back to, and I'm sure my colleagues would. But in the meantime, can I thank you so much for attending this morning and answering our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report in the discussion?
No,
thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group leaders to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme and note the monthly report from MOPAC? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Wednesday, 12th of March at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.